You don't really know anything. You may think you do until you realize you don't. The world as we see it has been and always will be painted by a marriage of our individual and collective beliefs, experiences, and environment. My world is not the same as your world. What I see is not necessarily what you see. Dan Victorious explores this phenomenon. The show focuses on a young witch who attends an art school only to forcibly take it over, bully the locals, and appoint herself as emperor. But there's a catch. We are told about the events of the story from the perspective of that witch, Tori Vega. And the show sort of bamboozles the audience into rooting for her. It is deceptively structured, using existing character archetypes or images to manipulate the audience into viewing her as the hero, a sort of genius. We are not meant to catch on to the fact that her subjects might actually be more talented than her, because this is her story. People watching the show when they're young, as is the intended audience, may not necessarily see through the little trick, though they usually catch on when they're a bit older. The touching thing about this whole situation is how perspectives can shift, given age, given time, given person. But it is the same show. It's the same story. Same character. Which story is true? Are any of them true? When given different perspectives, reality itself seems to...
102, take one.
With overlap, action please.
Ah, the French champagne has always been celebrated for its excellence. There is a California champagne by Paul Masson, inspired by that same French excellence. It's fermented in the bottle and like
This bumbling, drunken old man, believe it or not, at one point created what is considered by many to be the greatest film of all time. He is known as one of the few great geniuses of the 20th century. Or at least, he was. But that was all a long time ago. What happened to him could be seen as the greatest story of all the failings of Hollywood and the never-ending struggle between the artist and the establishment. Though it could also be a story of entitlement, ego, and a testament to the meaninglessness of the word genius. Or maybe both. The thing about Orson Welles is that it's very difficult to say anything about him that isn't true. But it's just about impossible to say anything that is. As of the writing of the first couple hundred drafts of this script, Orson Welles had been my greatest creative inspiration. Now, for reasons we'll get into, it's complicated. I relate to his drive on a spiritual level, though I'm often forced to ask myself whether that's a good or bad thing. He'd been my obsession for the better part of 2 years since I did a bit of research for him for an essay that I don't know if I'll ever finish. I was going to make a point about a particular monologue from one of his films. I was going to try my hand at challenging it. So I went watching some of his other stuff, and then his appearances in interviews, and before I knew it, I was thrown down a rabbit hole that I haven't quite been able to escape from. It is for this reason that I must tell you up front that there is no way that I can objectively write about Orson Welles, one way or the other. In fact, I don't think anyone, his admirers or his biggest critics, has quite been able to do so either. Orson Welles is a figure that has become more of an idea than an actual person. He really has only existed in mythology, both that built by the media, as well as that which he built himself.
That is my real secret. I do not know who I am.
The man was never above sensationalism, misdirection, or sometimes outright lying.
Have you been badly misquoted?
But I think everybody is, and everything. I don't think history can possibly be true.
This story is one about mythology, lies, and professional manipulation, about betrayal, rebellion, and old Hollywood politics, of the early days of radio, redefinition of cinema, and the troubled legacy of Western art. Something led him here. Somewhere along the lines, there is a story about how that great boy genius, who was promised the world, and became this tired, jaded old man, stumbling over his words and sipping on that French-inspired Californian champagne. This is a documentary slash retrospective slash think piece. I don't really know what this is, but it's a very long video, and it's about Orson Welles.
The French champagne has always been celebrated for its...
The magnificence of the Welleses finds us in early 20th century Kenosha, Wisconsin. In 1915, George Orson Welles was born to pianist Beatrice Eves and inventor Richard Head Wells.
Good afternoon, George.
What did he invent?
Anything we would know of?
He invented a great many things, none of which worked.
The few times Orson mentions him, he suggests not much.
Some of them were very successful. He invented something called the picnic.
But as little as he acknowledges his parents, there is no doubt that their exuberant lifestyle would shape the life that George would go on to live. They were a wealthy family traveling around the world. Apparently, according to my research, they were descended from two English kings, Henry III and Edward II, though, for all I know, all you white people are related to someone.
The magnificence of the ambassade was as conspicuous as a brass band at a funeral.
In any case, this was very much a privileged, wealthy little family, and young George had the luxury of pursuing virtually any studies or skills he wanted. It was at this time, his early childhood, that people started calling him a genius.
Are there any legends about you that you would like to scotch right now, like the fact that you, at the age of 4 months or something, wrote a thesis on Nietzsche's philosophy? There are all these incredible things.
Pack of lies.
From a young age, he was praised for his painting skills, acting, drawing, piano playing, and writing. He also did a bit of magic. Because of his father's clout, he had every professional, iconic possible figure mentor him. Beatrice and Richard would, however, separate when George was 6.
And my father was a kind of mad playboy.
Having him live with his mother. She died when he was 9.
When the Wright brothers came up with this thing, he said that that was a very good idea, but there was a basic fallacy, which was having the engine in the plane.
He moved back with his father, who then quit inventing.
Any fool could see that the airplane should be light enough and the engine should be on the ground.
A long-time alcoholic and womanizer, many wonder who was really taking care of whom in that house. His father took him along to places like China and Jamaica.
The West Indies, far from the cares of our busy modern world.
Before Orson was given the choice to go to the Todd School for Boys. It was there that he sharpened his skills in acting, directing, and writing, dazzling his teachers and peers. The IQ test he took reported that he had an IQ of 185, which does officially put him in the category of what we call genius. Though it should be noted that the validity of any test which claims to calculate a person's overall intelligence is dubious.
He liked to call himself an inventor because what he was, he came from an epoch in which you should pretend to be a great tycoon. You mustn't say you're a playboy. He was just a playboy. He inherited some money and he spent it. That was what he did.
Orson, at the advice of his mentor at the school, distanced himself from his debaucherous father.
So he built an airplane which was in effect a sort of glider. So there are two pictures I have. One is everybody lined up before, in front of the Stanley steamer and the glider. And the second one is the wreck of the airplane.
Eventually, he'd outright tell his father he wouldn't see him again. Maybe hoping this would help him stop his drinking. His father soon died, alone in his apartment, apparently drinking himself to death. George graduated from the Todd School and was taken in by a family friend, Maurice Bernstein.
Oops. Mr. Bernstein.
Then turning down an opportunity to study at Harvard.
I had a scholarship to go to Harvard. Hollywood is what I wanted to know. What I wanted to go to was Hollywood.
In favor of pursuing painting.
He said, before I go to this dreaded place, university, you must let me have a year off. He actually requested a gap year. He always innovative. He introduced in Chicago in 1931 the idea of the gap year.
Moving to Dublin, Ireland to live off being a painter. The fool. Because life sucks, it didn't work out. He went broke by the end of the summer and became homeless.
Oh, I guess I could have found myself an honest job as a dishwasher or something, but no, I took the easy way. I went on the stage.
It was then that he decided to shoot a shot at theater acting, getting a gig at the Gate Theater by apparently lying to them about his age and saying he was a famous Broadway actor.
Some reason they gave me the job. It was a very good part. I'd intimated that I was willing to stay on in Ireland.
And just like that, at the age of 16, through trickery and sheer audacity, his career started.
It was an easy start. I must confess to you that nothing's been easy since then.
We're hoping it'll be a good afternoon.
Today's a bullfight day, and that can be one of the most exciting days in the world, especially if there's good weather. Bullfighting needs the sun.
In a few minutes, we'll be joining Orson Welles at the bull ring here. But until we do that, I thought we ought to give you some idea of the kind of spectacle you'll be going to see.
Genius. What is genius? Who is she?
A ham sandwich.
According to Merriam-Webster, genius is extraordinary intellectual power manifested in creative activity. According to Immanuel Kant,
I can't believe you've
genius is defined as the natural ability to produce something beautiful without the conscious adherence to a set of established rules. To be able to do great work in a way that even you may not be able to understand. In other words, you're built different. Geniuses are often seen as being on some larger, superior intellectual plane to the average person. We may find that they're often treated differently than most people. Of course, in accordance with the definitions I've just established, the place where we most often see geniuses is in the arts, which makes sense considering that to be creative by definition means to see things differently than most people. It is said that sometimes you just have to let them cook, even if their conditions or the way they act goes against the conventions of regular society.
Ehrlich, du kannst mich behandeln, wie du willst. Weil das, was du machst, künstlerisch meine ich, das hat Qualität.
Ach, leck mich doch am Arsch.
However, does this make them superior? At what point does being cool and quirky and different just turn into privilege and double standard?
People can record things which have already happened. You know what such a record is called? A story.
Welles' career in theater and radio might be a bit difficult to appreciate now because neither of these mediums quite have the same place in culture as they did at that time. But to truly understand the Orson Welles story, or at least the version I'm choosing to tell, you need to understand just how big these mediums were and the fact that this child, before he even had a developed cranium, managed to gain a reputation as being a visionary at both in these short 10 years.
A little bit of luck.
And a dash of larceny.
After a year in Dublin, he attempted an acting career in London, then New York, but failed. However, he was soon introduced to actor Catherine Cornell and was hired to act in her road company, playing roles in Romeo and Juliet and other productions. In 1934, Orson organized a summer drama festival at the Todd School along with his master, who was now headmaster of the school, Roger Hill. This is the same Roger Hill who suggested he go to the school instead of live with his good-for-nothing father.
Useless.
This little drama festival is also notable for no reason whatsoever. Nothing else happened. Let's move on. Welles' theater career after his shows with the Cornell group would start to flourish. He met with John Houseman, who became his producer and right-hand man, and made his New York debut performing in Romeo and Juliet again that December. His first project with the WPA Federal Theater, a project sponsored by the US government to support struggling actors during the Great Depression, was with their Negro division. So Orson Welles did something that surprisingly, even now, would get some people bent out of shape.
The play was Macbeth, the Negro Macbeth.
He staged a production of Shakespeare's Macbeth, changed the setting to Haiti, and hired an all African-American cast. The unofficial title was Voodoo Macbeth.
In case you think this is a little too crazy to be believed, let me assure you that there was a Negro Macbeth, that is, a production with Negroes of Macbeth.
The Negro Theater Unit of the Federal Theater Project produced a highly successful version of Shakespeare's immortal tragedy Macbeth.
The trouble with talking about this point in Wells' career is that, of course, we don't have a lot of available footage, but this is the true start of what might be called the Orson Welles canon.
Our purpose was not as capricious and foolish as it may sound. We were anxious to give to Negro artists, who are so very talented, an opportunity to play in the sort of thing that's usually denied them. As you know, the parts that fall to Negroes are too often old mammies with bandanas and watermelon-eating pickaninnies and Uncle Rastuses and so on.
The play was an immediate hit and made Orson Welles' name quickly spread as a maverick and visionary new figure in the theater world. Voodoo Macbeth kept Shakespeare's script exactly as is, but changed the setting to Haiti in the 19th century, recounting the rise of slave-turned-emperor Henri Christophe.
Fortune. Tyrant, show thy face. My wife and children's ghost will haunt thee still. What is thy name?
In a 1982 interview, he stated that Voodoo Macbeth was his only great professional success. The streets were backed with traffic from both black and white patrons on opening nights, and played for 10 sold-out weeks.
In a way, this is a kind of early...
It was a bigger political event. And there was a riot that night. It was a big part of the black community that thought we were making fun because the word had gone out that it was, a kind of burlesque.
And everybody seemed to like the show. Critics were very kind to us, except for Mr. Percy Hammond.
Again, because this is theater, I can't give you any real review of this near century-old play, nor really do its success justice. This was a sensation. Orson Welles, already hailed as a genius by the few who knew him, was now a celebrity.
I need a smoke. You're not actors, you're smokers. You wouldn't know the church or the theater if it smacked you in the mouth.
Shut up, Orson, or I'll smack you in the
mouth.
They did several other projects with the WPA, but the second most notable work was The Cradle Will Rock.
And when everybody gets together, listen, you black legions, you Ku Kluxes, vigilantes hiding up there in the cradle of the Liberty Committee. When the storm breaks, the cradle will fall!
The first time a Welles production was sabotaged.
It was a play that the government tried to censor, or at least that was the
No, they did. They stopped it dead.
The Cradle Will Rock was to be an operatic sung-through play about corruption and corporate greed, prompting workers to unionize and stand up against the capitalist elites.
Worth that much to you, eh? Well, you take all that money and you go buy yourself a big piece of toast.
There were congressmen standing up and denouncing the whole thing as a communist conspiracy.
It was an original work written by and starring Mark Blitzen. This was really Mark's project.
A pro-labor, pro-union, pretty fighting radical opera by Mark Blitzstein, who was very far to the left.
But it was directed by Orson Welles and produced, of course, by John Houseman. However, the guards locked them out of the theater on opening night.
The doors were padlocked. And the audience waited out in the streets.
The official reason given was budgetary restrictions, but you'd have to be a real schmuck to hear that premise and believe that that was the reason.
And an hour and a half afterwards, we found an empty theater, and we marched the audience, luckily it was spring, 12 blocks down Broadway to the empty theater which we had rented. Actors' Equity said that the actors couldn't stand on the stage, so I told them to sit in the audience and that we'd do the opera there. Whenever they got a cue, they stood up and played it in the aisle. By the time the play was over, all the theaters had emptied, and all the actors came from all the other theaters and stood
to
in the
see
back
what you people were doing in there.
And the play ran 2 years.
Not the last time Welles got bullied for rocking the boat too much, but let's not get ahead of ourselves quite yet. In 1937, Welles and Houseman formed the Mercury Theatre. Their first production was a modern-day version of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar.
Brush up your Shakespeare.
Similar to how he treated Macbeth, It took the story and drew parallels to the then contemporary fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini.
Someone cooked here.
The play was considered groundbreaking, moving from the Mercury to the National Theatre, going for a total of 157 performances. Other productions they did included The Shoemaker's Holiday, Heartbreak House, Danton's Death, and Too Much Johnson. Too Much Johnson, interestingly enough, implemented, or at least tried to implement, filmed sequences to be a sort of Charlie Chaplin-esque silent comedy bit to accompany the play. Unfortunately, it didn't work out due to lack of proper projection and such for the film to be shown within the theater, so the whole play kind of fell through. The film sequences were then considered lost media.
What's going on? The sky is falling! The sky is falling!
Orson Welles had been doing radio work for years, doing small bits for news and whatnot, but it was at this time that he really started dipping his toes into the young medium by doing dramatic work. One of the first really notable ones being The Shadow.
Shadow knows.
Is it true that you were the voice of the Shadow?
You bet I was.
I actually love The Shadow. Prior to doing this project, my only experience listening to radio shows has been in cars on the way home from prep school, listening to this one strange religious program. It is a shame, really, that the radio drama has so largely fallen out of mainstream relevance, because this is great.
Who's opening that door?
Don't get up, Professor. I'll close it after me.
What? Who are you?
Your conscience. Professor, have you ever heard of the Shadow?
I used to imitate you doing that, and I thought I was pretty good at it.
You are better than I am, I'm sure.
The Shadow is based on a pulp magazine character who is a sort of proto-superhero, if you can call him that. He's this mysterious figure with hypnotic powers who's able to make himself invisible to those before him. He uses this hypnosis to intimidate and thwart criminals.
You seem to have heard of me.
What do you want?
I've come to warn you, Sneed.
Warn me? Warn me about what?
I know what you're doing.
What?
And I know how it's going to end.
It is the goofiest thing in the world and I love it. These stories are fun, voice acting's great, starring both Welles and fellow Mercury actor Agnes Moorehead. I especially like the way that Orson says, The Shadow.
The Shadow. Shadow.
It was inevitable that he would get into radio with that uncharacteristically booming voice. Crazy when you remember that at this point he was about 22. I am almost 22. I do not have a booming radio voice. I apologize. Orson the Illusionist was about to make his next great magic trick when he took his Mercury Theatre to radio and headed the now iconic and infamous Mercury Theatre on the Air. The Mercury Theatre on the Air was a special program because they dramatized hour-long adaptations of classic literature, taking suggestions from their audience each week. Again, this may not seem like all that much now, but radio at this point was this new, cheap, young medium. The equivalent of what something like social media content is now. And Mr. Welles and his crew were taking their distinguished, iconic, well-respected theater group to dramatize fine literature for every working class, average Joe Schmo to listen to every week. Also, this program featured music from then little-known composer Bernard Herrmann. So they do these dramatizations directed by Orson Welles every week, until one week when adapting the definitive sci-fi novel by H.G. Wells, Orson and the boys get a little idea for how to make the story a bit more immersive.
We are bringing you an eyewitness account of what's happening on the Wilmuth Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I on? Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmuth's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. More state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain's conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Oh, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. Flag of truce. If those creatures know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. A humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control...
Everyone run for cover!
If Voodoo Macbeth is what made Orson Welles a celebrity, War of the Worlds is what made him a legend. And no true word of the man has ever been written since.
I had no idea that I'd suddenly become a sort of national event. Walter Winchell, who was on an Arrival network, went on the air on his network and said, "Mr. and Mrs. America, there is no cause for alarm. America has not fallen. I repeat, America has not fallen."
War of the Worlds is a sci-fi novel detailing an alien invasion in a small part of England. So these absolute menaces took the story to radio and treated it like a regular newscast when all of a sudden you learn of an alien invasion happening in Jersey. It's only when they near the end of the program and there are police officers outside of the recording booth that Wells on the Mercury Theatre learn of the absolute number that they have apparently done on US radio listeners.
I met a welfare worker years later who told me he spent weeks trying to woo some of the refugees back to civilization.
America moment. For weeks and weeks on end, news of the chaos that arose after Orson Welles tricked everyone into believing there was an alien invasion flooded the papers.
Of our shows were more intensely dramatic.
The psychological reason that...
I simply don't know. I can't imagine. I mean, you must realize that when I left the broadcast last night, I went into dress rehearsal for a play that's opening in 2 days.
Wells had to do a press conference to explain himself on just what kind of stunt he was pulling.
Indeed.
Were you aware of terror at the time you were giving this role? Were you aware that terror was going on throughout the nation?
Oh, no, of course not.
For years and years and years on end, Wells testifies to multiple people coming to him with stories of what happened because of the panic that broadcast arose.
John Barham, the very famous American actor, was listening to the broadcast and hearing this on his radio, rushed out into his backyard where he kept 10 Great Danes, released the dogs, crying to them, "The world has fallen, fend for yourselves."
Were you in the War of the Worlds, the
Yes. I said, this woman said to me, "There are little green men in my backyard. There are little green men." I said, "Madam, it's just a story. It isn't. I see them. I see them. What am I going to do about it?" Well, they were hysterical. All these phone calls.
What did you recommend?
It was just so exciting to do it that way. He was the most exciting director you could possibly imagine. And of course, I love him dearly because he was very, very good.
Besides the next thing we're going to get into, this is easily the thing that Orson Welles is best known for. Hollywood, which was at this time in the absolute peak of what is now known as the Golden Age, had been beckoning to Orson to direct a film for them for a while, but he always declined. That rigid factory which policed every aspect of the process to make the most ideal possible product. I hope at this point I've communicated just how diametrically opposed to Orson Welles' ambitious nature that is. Back then, people didn't go to watch directors or see any kind of art or anything. The pictures were the pictures.
That's entertainment.
Really just cheap escapism made by faceless corporations to churn a profit and exploit poor families suffering financially during the Great Depression. The films from this time that we do remember are the absolute standouts. The absolutely exceptional, otherworldly masterpieces of cinema, but the vast majority of them are so formulaic, they're gone. Mostly burnt in fires because that's what they were always treated as by the studios. Disposable trash. Orson was never the type of person to survive in a system which treats art like that, at least not without being utterly miserable. He knew this, which is why he always rejected them, surely. He knew that taking the Hollywood deal, no matter how attractive it looked, would be nothing but trouble. Surely he knew that this medium of cinema, which grants him an aspect of every single creative outlet he loves, music, visual art, acting, directing, would consume him, even if he knew he would get screwed. Surely he knew that getting into the movies would be the end of his young, blooming career, right? Right? There is a difference between privilege and rights that many people, usually the privileged, tend to take for granted. Earlier I mentioned that artists have a way of being treated with a different standard than normal people. And it isn't without reason. Every great social movement, every large-scale socio-political shift has been driven by people who thought about the world differently than everyone else and put those ideas into the world. This is not an easy thing to do, getting attention, having the space to explore those ideas, research, introspect, and express those ideas. The truth of it is, most of how our society is structured is specifically designed to discourage this kind of activity. When you look back historically about the people who've moved society forward, the great geniuses and Renaissance men, at least the ones we acknowledge, have been, well, they've been men.
The few are those men of such intellectual and cultural superiority. Good and evil, right and wrong were invented for the ordinary average man, the inferior man.
Obviously you agree with Nietzsche and his theory of the Superman.
Yes, I do.
So did Hitler.
White ones, at least, prior to the 20th century. You think this is just because they've all been the smartest? Actually, some of you probably do. But the truth of it is, these are the people who've tended to have the privilege to tell their stories. Even though as well-intentioned as they may be, their perspectives will always be limited. If you get really Marxist about it, the elites keep the underprivileged, who probably have the most issue with how society is structured, busy with work, school, having to think about where their next meal is coming from. The average person simply doesn't have the time to be postulating and pontificating. They need to eat. And worse, even if they do manage to squeeze in some time to pontificate, how will they have their voices heard? Usually, to gain popularity with any sort of art or piece of writing, you gotta think about the money.
That's entertainment.
And the trouble with thinking about the money is that what sells is probably going to undermine the message of your story. You've had this conversation before. The now defunct RKO Studios offered Orson Welles an offer unlike anyone had ever gotten from a major Hollywood studio at this point. They granted him complete control to make any film he wanted with little to no interference from the studio. They gave him the money, it was just up to him to do whatever the hell he wanted with it. Welles told them that these were the only circumstances under which he would make a film because he was so sure that they wouldn't do it.
I got that good a contract because I didn't really want to make a film. I didn't want money. I wanted authority.
So naturally he did the only thing he knew out at this point and redefined the medium forever, creating what is consistently cited as the greatest film of all time. The Heart of Dark. Wait, no, that one fell through. Heart of Darkness, an adaptation of the novel of the same name about the horrors of colonialism, was the film that Orson Welles set out to make as his debut in 1940. But despite much preparation, the project collapsed. Stuff happened, budget stuff. Also at one point RKO demanded Orson hire a bunch of white people to go in blackface to play the Africans. Of course he refused. Our boy is definitely above that barbaric practice and there is no way I'm gonna eat my words later. His film debut technically ended up being a narration job for Swiss Family Robinson. Until even before he started, Welles was only funding films by working jobs he didn't care about. Literally me, Orson. Literally me. Oh, okay. Alright, for real this time. Orson Welles utterly clapped Hollywood right in the tuchus with his debut feature, the one, the only, the Citizen Kane of movies, the greatest and possibly only good thing to come out of America. I mean Hollywood. I mean America. Citizen Kane. I've spoken about Citizen Kane on this channel before, and I'll do it again. Conceptualized and co-written by Orson Welles and Herman Mankiewicz, the greatest film of all time hardly needs introduction.
That one single person makes a decision about what's good or what's bad.
The thing about Citizen Kane is that if you watch it now without any of the context, not knowing the history of Hollywood or what a film looked or felt like prior to this, you likely wouldn't think of it as anything special, but I can assure you this is the greatest testament to its impact. There are technical stuff that film nerds like me are gonna wax on about, like the deep focus, the fact that half of these images are actually illustrated to give the illusion of a larger budget, or the fact that they showed ceilings. Would you believe that films never used to show ceilings before this? Then there are the really poetic stuff like the little parallels, the single take unbroken shots. There's wild little unnecessarily cool stuff like this.
6 years ago, I looked at a picture of the world's greatest newspapermen. I felt like a kid in front of a candy store. Well, tonight, 6 years later, I got my candy. All of it.
But what's relevant to our conversation here is the story.
Isn't it wonderful? Such a pot.
We follow this decade-spanning character study taken from the perspective of several people in his life. Ex-wives, ex-friends.
I didn't know we were speaking. Sure we're speaking, Jedediah. You're fired.
The media.
Election spoke for millions, was hated by as many more.
To ask the question of what this great newspaper tycoon meant on his deathbed when he uttered the word We watch this man's slow moral degradation, though ultimately we can't really know exactly who he was or who or what this rosebud thing is. He's dead.
Now, what I'd like to know is, where did you get the confidence from to make a film with such...
Ignorance. Sheer ignorance. Only when you know something about a profession, I think that you're timid.
Many people try to take away as much credit as possible from Orson Welles, who boasts a co-writer, director, producer, and star credit, but the most you can lobby against him, as he said himself, is that he hired a bunch of really talented people. Mankiewicz's cynicism and personal grudge against a certain tycoon, William Randolph Hearst, holds the core of this anti-capitalist script. Striking cinematography by Greg Toland gives this decade-spanning character study its bombastic, theatrical atmosphere. The actors hired from the Mercury Theatre Group brought life to these characters. But the most important thing I want to establish here is that Orson might have, for not the first time, not even the last time, been playing himself.
The fighting liberal, the friend of the working man, the next governor of this state, to point out and make public the dishonesty.
The notion that Kane himself is some sort of version of myself, I really fail to recognize. Maybe out of blindness, but...
When I say Welles was playing himself, it's very interesting in a kind of prophetic way.
I don't like prophecies.
The part of Citizen Kane where we see a young Charlie Kane, 25 years old, taking over the newspaper, here for the people, losing his place of privilege to stand up for the underprivileged.
You're talking to two people. Charles Foster Kane is a scoundrel. His paper should be run out of town. A committee should be formed to boycott him. On the other hand, I am the publisher of the Inquirer.
It's clear that he's playing himself at this exact moment in time. It's kind of hypnotic. There are differences between Welles and Kane, the main one being that Kane is a man who had material possessions and was driven mad because he lost his soul, while Welles is a man who had a soul but lost. Well, we'll be getting into that much sooner than you think. Citizen Kane was a flop. It won awards, it got the Oscar for Best Screenplay, but it tanked financially. That man, William Randolph Hearst, made sure of that. He saw just a bit too much of himself in that character. Critiquing the rich and famous was not as cool and quirky as it is now. Hollywood doesn't like flops. They took a chance on this young guy, gave him a deal completely unprecedented. They let it hit theaters without any interference. They got a flop. Orson Welles went right to work on his next project, which was to be better than Kane, taking his Mercury Theatre Group and getting to work on The Magnificent Ambersons, a film based on a novel based on his father.
Good afternoon, George.
The picture I made, Ambersons, is partly based on him, not by me, but by Tarkington, who wrote the book, who was a friend of my father's.
You remember his father, the inventor alcoholic.
Useless.
The novel of the Magnificent Ambersons details a changing time and how power can shift given age.
What must be wonderful?
To be so important as that.
Oh, that isn't important. Good evening. Anybody that really is anybody ought to be able to do about as they like in their own town, I should think.
A wealthy family from a small town fades into obscurity as the industrial period takes shape. George Amberson, the youngest Amberson, privileged, rich kid, never had to work a day in his life, general piece of shit.
Where is this talk? Where does it come from? Who does it?
Why, I suppose pretty much everybody. I know it's pretty general.
Who said so?
Why?
How did you get hold of it?
Why?
You answer me!
Why, how do you think it would be fair to give names?
Look here.
Takes great issue when the father of a girl he likes.
Oh, him. I suppose he's some old widower. Some old widower.
Yes, he is a widower. I ought to have told you before. He's my father.
Oh.
Who happens to be an inventor of horseless carriages.
Horseless carriages. Automobiles.
Hmm?
People aren't going to spend their lives lying on their backs in the road letting grease drip in their face.
Starts getting really close to his mother.
They think that they were right in saying that she was in love with him before my father died.
Why, George, don't you know that's what they say?
He sees this inventor man as nothing more than riffraff.
What have I done that wasn't honorable and right? You think these riffraff can go around town banding my mother's good name?
It really is a wonderful novel, and Wells's film captures some of the magic of the novel, but with a more cynical, somewhat darker edge, where Wells, not assisted by any other screenwriters this time, changes the ending of the novel a bit to something slightly strange, much darker, or so I've heard. But it's clear that this story was a far more personal one to Wells, as for once, he won't even deny that this one has connections with his real life. After completing what should have been his life's work, Wells was commissioned by the United States government to shoot 3 documentaries in South America.
I was told that it was my patriotic duty to go and spend $1 million shooting the carnival in Rio.
He had just been appointed Ambassador of Goodwill to Latin America by the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, and this was a production between them and RKO to promote good relations between the Americas. And not positive if you ask me, but the history with these kinds of documentaries is that there's a bad trend of powerful countries at this time making demeaning, condescending, dare I say, propagandistic documentaries about smaller countries.
The West Indies, far from the cares of our busy modern world.
Shut the fuck!
However, Orson Welles shoots his Brazilian footage with an empathy we would soon see in his later documentaries, though with this one, he never quite inserts himself into the footage more than he needs to. What he does here is serve as a healthy bridge between the North American viewer and the perhaps underrepresented Brazilians.
By filming the hit song Farewell Praça 11, Welles joined the people in their protest.
There were 2 main films, really pseudo-documentaries shot by Welles. One was about Carnival and the other was a reenactment of the arrival of 4 fishermen. 4 local heroes, actually.
Well, I remember it was a sunny, beautiful day, and it was a nightmare. The harbor was full of sailboats, putting up sail, getting ready to reenact the Jangadeiros' triumphant entry into Rio Harbor. And then the impossible happened.
Tragically, there was an accident caught on film, which overturned the rafts and cost the leader of the group his life.
Que ele olhou, viu foi uma onda grande. Aí o finado jacaré subiu na onda, aí deu assim com a mão pro papai, né?
And Orson was so undone, he must have made the decision at that point that he would make this film no matter what.
Orson resolved to finish the film as a tribute, perhaps immortalizing the man in the realm of art.
Tanto que o Getúlio era ditador, esperando por ele que eles chegaram todos encharcados.
Vargas promised the Jangadeiros the social benefits they sought. Their jangada was carried in triumph through the streets. 3 months had passed since their voyage when Welles came to Brazil, and the Jangadeiros were still national heroes.
He immerses us into this world, putting the people at the center, the working class, everyday people of Brazil. This was their story, after all. They were excited to have this cool Hollywood guy in their city to bring their story to a larger audience, and Orson was welcomed by them too. That's when he got the call.
And when I'd nearly finished the film, it occurred to me that the origins of samba lay in voodoo ceremonies, and so I arranged with a good deal of difficulty to film a voodoo ceremony. And we had protracted conversations with the head of the group before he came to my office in Rio to discuss it. And it was my unhappy lot to have to tell him the entire project was off.
Project was terminated. The Magnificent Ambersons had been recut, completely removing the original ending and losing most of the footage. And Orson was fired from RKO.
Action, Orson, please.
Just do anything?
No, it's sorry, cut.
While Wells had been filming in South America, there were some changes happening in RKO Studios. Nelson Rockefeller, who was the main supporter of the Assault True project, left the board of directors, and the president of RKO resigned. When The Magnificent Ambersons was shown in test screenings, audience reactions were unsatisfactory. They didn't get the ending. It was all a bit too weird. The studio didn't want that, so they recut it to be more akin to the novel, more suitable for a traditional Hollywood romance. If you're watching this having seen The Magnificent Ambersons prior to knowing about this, the comment I made before about Wells considering this his greatest and most personal work may have had you scratching your head. As I didn't mind the first time I saw it, seeing people rave about the potential it might have had.
No scene in a hospital or nothing like that ever. And the great long scene.
I held the preview cards in my hand. There were these terrible reactions to the picture that said that, you know, everybody who made it ought to be hanged. And the other 5 to 10 to 20 that said it was only the greatest movie ever made.
The Magnificent Ambersons we have now is good. It's very good, but it doesn't necessarily stand out that much more than any other old Hollywood romance. There are a few quirky elements. The acting is phenomenal, a tad melodramatic. Agnes Moorehead is especially going off here.
I wouldn't mind if they hadn't.
Kind of frightens me in one scene.
I wouldn't mind if it burned me, George! This particular part that I was doing, he said to me, now, I want you to play it like a little girl. Oh. The second time, he said, I want you to play it like an insane woman. For God's sake, get up! And then the next time, he said, now, I want you to play it like she's absolutely inebriated. Stop it! And again, he said, now, I want you to play without absolutely, just an absolutely vacuous mind. Do you hear me? And I did it 11 times. Different characterizations 11 times. And then the 12th time, after he was absolutely satisfied with the technical part of it, he said to me, now play it.
There, that's better. Now let's see where we stand.
Then it makes sense when you hear that her character was to have a much larger role.
The great long scene, which was the key long scene at the end, which was Aggie Moorehead in a third-rate lodging house. And that was the best scene in the picture. That was what the picture was about.
But now The Magnificent Ambersons has gone down in history as one of the greatest films that might have been.
It probably was among the 5 most important films made, I think, in America, ever. And it's, I think, the greatest artistic tragedy in the movies that that particular film was so mutilated, because you barely get a sense of what it was.
It's gone. The whole end of it, the whole actual plot was changed. In other words, it's about the time Major Amberson dies, the picture starts to go to become another picture, becomes their picture.
Do you ever get over something like that?
Not really, you don't.
Wells begged and pleaded with them to let him continue filming It's All True. He begged for the equipment, he didn't want to do this to the locals, but it was done.
Near it, and I wasted many years of my life. If I turned my back the way they did on it, I would have been much better. But I kept trying to be loyal to it. And it began a pattern of trying to finish pictures, which has plagued me ever since.
This is one of the 3 key reasons why Orson Welles believes that this film was always cursed. First was the death of Jacques Auray, now this. We'll get into that third one. Orson returned to the US to show them the footage of the carnival.
They ask to see the rushes of what I'm doing in South America. And they see a lot of people, black people, and the reaction is, he's just shooting a lot of jimboos jumping up and down, you know? They didn't even hear the samba music because it hadn't been synced up.
They rejected it because there were too many black people and white people coexisting and having a grand old time. Also, too much of a focus on the working class. This was hardly the travelogue that they hired him to film.
That's entertainment.
So yeah, Orson Welles and Mercury Productions were kicked off the lot, soon struggled to find work. Not just general work, some radio shows and a touring magic show for the American World War II soldiers, along with Rita Hayworth, who he'd soon marry. He also got some acting jobs. Welles maintains that he always had a good relationship with the actual people in Hollywood, but the studios wouldn't hire him as a director. He was finally thrown a bone in 1946 when producer Sam Spiegel from International Studios allowed him to do The Stranger. This was a noir based on the novel of the same name, which follows a secret posing as a school teacher whose past is eventually uncovered by a war crimes investigator.
Proclaim your guilt. Only thus you can attain salvation.
It's a decent noir, you can find it on YouTube. The most interesting thing about it is that it was a success.
With silver you can turn your dreams to gold. Oh, we're in the money.
It was Orson Welles' only directorial success that he had in his career. The most interesting thing about the film itself, to me at least, is that Orson Welles can work a mustache.
You should have told me. I've not carried this awful thing around by yourself.
This stranger, goes to America undercover, hoping that no one will know who he is. This is the most invisible that Orson Welles has been on screen as an actor or off screen as a writer-director. He's trying to chameleon his way back into Hollywood, hoping that none of his apparent difficulties expose him once again.
A psychiatrist could explain it better. The German sees himself as the innocent victim of world envy and hatred conspired against, set upon by inferior peoples, inferior nations. He cannot admit to error, much less to wrongdoing. Not the German.
It checks out, he played it safe for this one. After almost half a decade of being ostracized from filmmaking, he didn't want to mess it up.
We chose to ignore Ethiopia and Spain, but we learned from our casualty list the price of looking the other way. Men of truth everywhere have come to know for whom the bell tolled, but not the German. He still follows his warrior gods, marching to Wagnerian strains, his eyes still fixed upon the fiery sword of Siegfried.
So he followed the rules, towed the line, and didn't bother with any of his trademark Wellesisms.
And in those subterranean meeting places that you don't believe in, the German's dream world comes alive when he takes his place in shining armor beneath the banners of the Teutonic Knights. Mankind is waiting for the Messiah, but for the German, the Messiah is not the Prince of Peace. He's another Barbarossa, another Hitler.
He himself didn't really like the product, but it was made, it got the money. With said money, he went on to do an expensive, epic stage musical based on the novel Around the World in 80 Days. It flopped miserably.
And for a while there, I thought it was me that was crazy. After what I'd been through, anything crazy at all seemed natural.
He then went to work on the noir The Lady from Shanghai, starring himself and his then wife, though separated, Rita Hayworth.
Now, Mr. O'Hara, if you'll show me to the nearest bar, we'll sit down together and discuss your coming to work for me.
Adapted from the novel If I Die Before I Wake, the story follows a young Irish sailor who gets entangled with the affairs of a seductress and a rich tycoon husband.
And what was I, Mike O'Hara, doing on a luxury yacht, pleasure cruising in the sunny Caribbean Sea, chasing a married woman? But that's not the way I wanted to look at. To be a real prize fathead like Mike O'Hara, you've got to swallow whole all the lies you can think up to tell yourself.
He ends up getting framed for murder. A noir plot if there ever was one. What makes this interesting though is that we follow that skepticism of the rich elites we saw in Kane and would have seen in Amberson's. But like it's all true, it's taken from the perspective of the working class.
I was thinking it was only your husband you wanted to kill.
Why don't you try to understand?
One who follows his nature keeps his original nature in the end.
That scene, for example, then, would you change anything about that now?
Well, I know what I changed from listening to it, which is the awful soundtrack.
But you did plan for me to follow you.
You've been drinking.
I presume you think that if you murder me here, your sailor friend will get the blame, and you'll be free to spend my money.
That may have been our projector.
No, it wasn't. It's Harry Cohn.
Well, dear, you aren't the only one who wants me to die. The letter tells all about you, lover.
What happened was that after the my version of it, which got its one preview, Harry decided to fix the music.
These mirrors, it's difficult to tell. You are aiming at me, aren't you? I'm aiming at you, lover. Of course, killing you is killing myself. It's the same thing. But you know, I'm pretty tired of both of us.
Sonic version under the shootout in the mirror scene. So instead of just hearing the crash of glass, you have all through it. It kind of louses up the proceedings.
But it made him happy.
Yes, it made him happy.
They didn't like how Wells made Hayworth's character a blonde, despite Hayworth, #1 Hollywood sex icon at this time, being an iconic redhead. They also added a bunch of close-ups of Hayworth's face and body because not enough male gaze, I guess. Now considered one of the best films he produced under Hollywood, and one of the great entries into the film noir canon, it was a flop.
Black and midnight hags! I conjure you by that which you profess. How here you come to know it? Answer me! Though you untie the winds and let them fight against the churches, though yes the waves confound and swallow.
The same year, Wells managed to book a deal with a smaller studio, Republic Pictures, to make what was certainly, more than anything else, a passion project of his.
Brush up your Shakespeare.
Sometimes I forget how much of a theater kid Wells really was in the end, but his Shakespeare adaptations, while I've never been much of a Shakespearean myself, are electric.
Bubble, boil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. All hail Macbeth! Hail to thee, Thane of Glamis!
Still you imperfect speakers, tell me more!
Macbeth is perhaps the most ambitious, experimental, visually striking of his works thus far.
Tell me more!
Albeit on a visibly microscopic budget. All the performances,
Sorely charged. I would not have such a heart in my bosom.
If chance will have me king, why, chance may crown.
Tell me more!
This is what a King Cruel song looks like.
Hamburgerphobia. Hamburgerphobia.
What is that noise?
Here we have another story of a young man taken by a lust for power and perhaps a bloated ego, who seizes an opportunity to climb that ladder, to claim his glory, but must pay the consequences. This lust for power has now driven him to unspeakable acts, and now the guilt haunts him. The blood, perhaps permanently stuck to his hands. He can blame his wife all he wants. He can blame the witches who inflated his head, planted the seeds of this lust all he wants. But he knows what he did. That flop too.
You still have a certain arrogance, though, do you not? You don't live in the United States or in the...
You think it's arrogant not to?
Well, I sometimes wonder. I don't know why you do not live here. And there...
Well, let me give you an answer.
All right.
I had to get some... I had to get some...
Wells had always been a world traveler, as mentioned before, but here started how he ostensibly spent the rest of his career, making films in Europe.
What the fellow said.
In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. So long, Howard.
Yes, I was noticing continuity between the trial and a lot of your films dating back to Citizen Kane, as your view seems to be opposed to some of the best interests of the corporate elite, of which you speak directly about. And I was wondering if you thought your personal financial position directly related to the fact that a lot of your views in your films throughout these ages have not exactly expressed their interests.
Would anybody like to answer that question?
Orson Welles found himself in what was then called the Red Scare. For those of you unaware of this moment in history, the Red Scare was a period just after World War II when the US was getting rather paranoid about possible communist infiltration among the people.
In a series of dawn raids, FBI agents swooped down on communists indicted on charges of advocating the violent overthrow of the government.
Run for your lives! So one of the first places they went for was the entertainment industry.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
The House Un-American Activities Committee sought to weed out and blacklist potential filmmakers with communist leanings and/or sympathies, and began hearings.
I believed at that time that Mr. Sorrell was a communist because of all the things that I had heard.
Some directors and actors, perhaps most infamously,
Elia Kazan is a traitor,
were tried and pressured to drop some names of Hollywood members who were considered potential communists.
I'm going to raise a certain period in your life because very early on when you started out, you were a member of the Communist Party.
Yes.
And then during the McCarthy era, in 1952, you were called to testify.
He is a man who sold to McCarthy.
Named a lot of names. What did you hope to gain by that?
Gain nothing, it's just the truth.
All of his companions.
It is for this reason that many in Hollywood lost respect for Kazan. And while he's made some good stuff, he's largely seen as a traitor.
The billion people are going to know that there are people in Los Angeles who will not be silent when a confessed snitch, stool pigeon, gets an award. You can't separate his art from his life, and you can't separate his life from the lives he ruined.
Kazan is nothing more than a lowly stool pigeon of the McCarthy area. He is a disgrace to the humankind.
The most famous director who was blacklisted at this time was probably Charlie Chaplin, who made a career for himself making anti-capitalist satire. While he was the most wealthy man in Hollywood, he did grow up impoverished in Victorian England. His famous character, the Tramp, is basically a stand-in for the working man run over by capitalist exploitation. He also made that film where he satirized that dreadful man who stole his mustache, and ended it with a powerful speech calling out every form of bigotry and human greed.
I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. In this world there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. Greed has poisoned men's souls.
Acknowledging that they all share in this system of evil. Now, if you've reached this far into the video, it should come as no surprise to you who else might have made it to
Charles
that
Foster
list.
Kane, in every essence of his social beliefs and by the dangerous manner in which he has attacked the American traditions of private property, is, in fact, nothing more or less than a communist.
Que a polícia criou clima de que quem se aproximasse de Jacaré era comuna.
At this time, Chaplin, soon to live in Europe himself, actually directed and starred in a film inspired by an idea by Welles, who was originally set to direct.
Good and evil.
Too much of either will destroy us all.
We can never have too much good in the world.
We've never had enough.
I'm tempted to do one of these retrospectives for Chaplin as well.
Give me a story with a moral to it. The tragic example of a life of crime.
I don't see how anyone can be an example in these criminal times.
But given some of the things he's done.
That's business.
Well, other people don't do business that way.
That's the history of many a big business.
I cannot in good conscience speak of him more gleefully than I already have.
Wars, conflict, it's all business. One murder makes a villain. Millions a hero. Numbers sanctify, my good fellow.
That's the trouble with artists, you know, as brilliant as their ideas are, and as much as they can inspire you, they're also people. People quite capable of disappointing you.
Okay, thank you all very much. I think I can just slip away.
I thought I killed this fear years ago. It gets in the way of creativity, but I've been forced to recognize how much it still haunts me. Reducing a human being to an image, a symbol representing some idea. Throughout most of high school, I was generally known as the artist. That said, I was the GOAT. But I was only that. I was this character. Though, within my immediate circle, of course, there was a few other things. Some saw me as a goal to overcome, others as a nerd, victim of the local bully. Some saw me as a joke character, some saw me as an aspirational figure, others saw me as that one chill guy.
I can't imagine why, but I love hearing it.
People have these different contrasting ideas of you as a person based on their interactions and or impressions. None of these images is completely true, but none of them is necessarily false either. It scares me. This has created in me this urge, perhaps at a subconscious level, to subvert, to refuse to be put in a box. This was actually one of the big things that kept me from starting YouTube before I did. Partially because this attitude makes me very experimental as an artist, which, as I know from experience, is bad for creating a social media audience. But also because I've always wanted to make fiction, but if I make a YouTube channel and start speaking all candidly about my thoughts...
I guess so. Have you been badly misquoted?
But I think everybody is, and everything. I don't think history can possibly be true.
People will have perceptions of me. Some of them resembling the truth more than others. All of this will affect how they interpret my work. I mentioned in my last video that I want to be famous, or at least Tensai does. But not me, not Judah. I don't exist, or at least I don't want to be seen.
This is Mr. E.R. Bradshaw. He cannot be seen. Now, I'm going to ask him to stand up. Mr. Bradshaw, will you stand up, please? This demonstrates the value of not being seen.
Believe it or not, Eraserhead is my most spiritual film.
Why elaborate on that?
No.
Generally, I subscribe to the David Lynch method of don't explain. Make of the stories what you will. But if there was ever to be some course which required people to study my fiction for whatever reason, the last video essay I uploaded would be required reading.
All right. I'm not excusing myself from this either. I will have someone play me to delve into the murky, cowardly depths of my lonely, fucked up being.
As would this one. I have never had so many people interpreting, speculating, and engaging with discourse about me and the stuff that goes on in my head. And I don't know how I feel about it.
Oh, now you have done it.
What have I done that wasn't honorable and right?
Oh.
You think these riffraff can go around town banding my mother's good name?
I have perhaps voluntarily allowed myself to become a character, to be interpreted and discussed.
Why, George, don't you know that's what they say? George! What are you gonna do, George?
I chose to make a stylized essay where I explore different schools of thought that have crossed my mind over the years of my creative journey, regarding a particular aspect of my life. A large one, but just one aspect nonetheless. I must suppress the urge to correct people when they go into the comments and make some assessment that deviates from the truth.
One of the recurrent images in your films is of electricity arcing, is of light bulbs crackling on, and you have a recurrent motif of like 2 points and something arcing between them. And it seems to me that this somehow relates to what you think about the synaptic arcs in our brain. When you talk about TM, when you talk about these things, you talk about making connections. It seems to me that that's what that recurrent visual motif is about. Am I right in thinking that that's at least in the right area? No.
But I fear more than they, the ones who are correct. Some felt lifted by my story, others were confused, some were inspired, some were horrified. It is such a strange and complex feeling which frankly stresses me out, but it's also kind of beautiful. We as people interpret each other and our own lives as stories. Stories are made up of these images coming from age-old narratives. We continue these narratives and make assessments based on them. But none of them can be completely true. Here in the West, we love those heroes' journeys to propel the narrative of some soul figure overcoming these great obstacles and barriers. We challenge ourselves to live up to them, but
it's interesting, you used the word visionary there, and a lot of our viewers, they ask questions about that term and about the term creative genius, and you've called yourself that, and you've kind of equated yourself to all these different people, Da Vinci, Walt Disney, Steve Jobs, Michelangelo. Why do you feel the need to call yourself that?
Because otherwise I'm called celebrity, I'm called nigger, I'm called rapper. And when they use the word celebrity, nigger, or rapper, it's not in a positive way. And all these things, all those words can be used in an extremely positive way. What's up, my nigga? But that's not the way it's used. So I have to define who I am.
we are all bound by the images around us. You're born with certain body parts, you are given a gender which society will project onto you for the rest of your life. You are born with a certain skin tone or bone structure. Now you must deal with the consequences of being given a race. Of course, none of these images really exist in any concrete sense, but we do see them. On an institutional level, let me drop the artsy shtick for a second just to say on an institutional level. It's not just an individual thing, it's on an institutional level. And with them come attached narratives, which will inform every part of our waking lives, no matter how we choose to engage or not engage with them. One may feel tempted to believe they can pretend as though these images do not exist. Some are given the privilege of not having to think about their images at all. But we will always be affected by these narratives, whether we are conscious of it or not. Promptly after finishing Macbeth, still in Italy, presumably while filming Black Magic, Wells got to work on his next Shakespeare adaptation, Othello. Hollywood didn't want him anymore and he knew that now. This was purely out of love, produced by Roman Studio, funded almost entirely by Wells, taking on a ton of acting jobs. Othello inched along. Production started and stopped when funds came and went. This was an indie movie in every sense, but Italy was the place to do that. They were enjoying their neorealism movement and micro-budget filmmaking was the norm. Though Wells was making a Shakespearean period drama rather than some intimate story about poverty. It is also worth noting that Wells was offered work in neorealism but declined. Though you would think Orson would thrive in Italy, this just proved to be its own battle.
I'd been happy if the general camp, pioneers and all, had tasted her sweet body. Brush up your Shakespeare.
Othello's story of paranoia, rage, and ego is a perfect transition from the film's noir, though once again, there is visually more freedom at present here. Orson's final feature he completed in his life would be a TV documentary where he spoke about its development.
What we're going to talk about is Othello, Shakespeare's play, and the film I made of it. And that sounds rather arrogant, doesn't it? Just naming the two in the same sentence.
While I definitely have my own preferences both for Shakespeare and his work overall, it's hard not to see why he and many others consider this to potentially be his peak. What I will say is that this is definitely the most inventive, raw, and free we see Welles as a filmmaker and actor. Like Macbeth, this is a highly painterly film that truly feels like something out of another century in all the best possible ways. Simultaneously looking like something that could have come out way later than the 1950s, but also like something from a time now reserved to mythology. This story of a man, at least, manipulated into believing he was betrayed, would lead into this next film. An original this time, not some novel or play adaptation or collaboration. This one was all Welles, and personally one of his strangest, if you ask me.
Circus, why come to me? I am a legitimate entertainer now. Please watch your smoking. I am only interested in my fleas. And now we are rehearsing. Besides, I have to get ready for a show in a few minutes, so I cannot give you much time. Oh, please, please, please. The fleas don't like it. Who likes it?
Will you at least try guessing?
Have you ever seen a football game? Alley hoops. Between alley hoops. Alley hoops.
At this point, Orson Welles was a full-blown art house filmmaker working on shoestring budgets. Mr. Arkadin bears some resemblance to Citizen Kane in that we watch this mysterious tycoon hire a young foreigner to rewrite his history, to cover up his uncomfortable past.
It's me I want you to investigate. What is it you're so afraid they're going to find out?
Though he claims to not have any memory of it himself.
I wish I knew. I do not know who I am.
Only the protagonist, in search of the truth, finds that everyone who knows Arkadin's past gets killed off.
Why'd you grow that awful beard?
To scare people with.
Welles, as he tends to do, plays the titular Arkadin, while his daughter is played by Paola Mori, who would soon become his third and final wife.
Alley hoops.
You may notice Arkadin had a higher production than that of Othello because for this one he had European investors. And would you believe they pulled a Hollywood and pushed him out of the edit? Several differently edited versions of Mr. Arkadin have been passed around for decades, and the film itself goes by different names. There is Mr. Arkadin, then there's Confidential Report. Welles reportedly wasn't feeling quite himself while working on this either, which is perhaps why the production in this one is so strange, even for him. He'd show up drunk, he'd waste whole days of filming. I don't think I dislike any of Welles' work, but Arkadin, more than any of the others, I really don't know how I... Strange days for the man.
Will you let me tell this in my own way?
Orson Welles went to England, surely a fate worse than death, but while there he made a couple really interesting things for television. Orson Welles, never snobbed to new, low forms of art, brought his eccentricities to what was then known as the Idiot Box, and made 2 mini-documentary/essay-ish projects for the BBC. Both of these projects are retroactively seen as prototypes for what we now call the video essay. Orson Welles' sketchbook is a delightful little series that introduced us to what is now, frankly, one of my favorite genres.
Because I was once involved in a variety of interplanetary invasion, people often ask me what I think about flying saucers.
Letting Orson Welles talk about whatever the hell he wants.
It was the beginning of respect. As I told you, I threw myself on my head. It seemed the only thing I could do. Falling on my head is probably what made me an actor.
I've no doubt been sprinkling this essay with clips from this cute little series.
And there was a dinner party, very select and elegant, the night of this broadcast, which was Halloween Eve. And about halfway through dinner, the butler arrived and said to the host, "I beg pardon, sir, but New Jersey has just fallen." Nobody panicked. They waited till the next course, and the butler came around again, and the host said, "What was that, Meadows, you said about, where'd you hear that?" Meadows said, "On the radio, sir." Host said, "Meadows, have you ascertained who it is that's attacking us?" Meadows says, "I believe it's interplanetary, sir."
I'm gonna do the inevitable plot twist where I turn on him in a second, but this series, as well as his later interviews he do for television in the 70s and 80s, are what took me from a fan of Orson Welles the filmmaker to a fan of Orson Welles the guy. a year ago. This man can talk. And he's spitting too. The episode Police is what really won me over, and to deny the fact that at least a good chunk of the reason why Wells was kicked out of Hollywood was due to his then progressive takes would be naive.
Had to do with a Negro soldier. Here he is. The boy had seen service in the South Pacific. He was on his way home. He was on a bus. On the way, he fell ill. He asked the bus driver to let him off. The bus driver refused abusively. A policeman was called in, who dragged the boy out of the bus, took him behind a building, and beat him viciously. And when he was unconscious, poured gin over him, put him in jail, charged him with drunkenness and assault. When the boy regained consciousness, he discovered that he was blind.
If he isn't wrong about his eyes, he lost them.
The policeman had literally beaten out his eyes.
I'm going to do something about that.
Of course, that sort of policeman is the exception.
Pack of lies.
That sort of policeman is a criminal in uniform.
All the affidavits from all the policemen in the world won't protest his eyes back in his head. Somebody beat that boy with a stick until he lost his sight. Now that somebody is nobody. He's vanished. He's never been heard of. He hasn't any name.
I had the satisfaction of being instrumental in bringing that particular policeman to justice.
Being suspect of the police at this time, believe it or not, was not uncommon, but hearing how much Orson did for this black man who had his life ruined by one of these oink men.
The case was brought to my attention, and I brought it to the attention of the radio public, and we did finally manage to locate this man and to bring him into a court of law.
And the genuine...
Why should we make trouble? Well...
passion.
We don't, because we don't want to get into trouble with the police.
He seems to have.
To demand to know what business it is of mine.
We're told that we should cooperate with the authorities.
God judge me if it isn't the most pressing business I have.
I'm not an anarchist. I don't want to overthrow the rule of law. The contrary, I want to bring the policeman to law.
If we can't die in behalf of progress, we can live for it.
Obviously, individual effort won't do any good. There's nothing an individual can do about protecting the individual in society.
As someone who does this myself, I recognize when I see someone implying more than they're allowed to say.
I'm not an anarchist.
Pack of lies.
The rest of the episodes are similar, though this is the one that stood out the most to me. Also interesting that we see Orson Welles the illustrator for once. One might forget that this is what he originally set out to do back when he was a teenager. Then there's Around the World with Orson Welles.
This is Orson Welles behind the camera. A camera focused for this program on a fairly out-of-the-way and little-known corner of Europe. The land of the Basques.
Or more accurately, to a few places in Europe with Orson Welles.
A village is a village, and it doesn't make any difference what language it speaks.
Well, of course it doesn't for a child.
Not for a child unless you tell them so.
This project is objectively a travesty, but Orson, the magician, the hypnotist, the shadow, does his best to hide just how much of a travesty it is. Around the World follows Orson Welles go to Basque again, Vienna, France, London, and finally Spain, to watch some bullfighting.
We're hoping it'll be a good afternoon.
Today's a bullfight day, and that can be one of the most exciting days in the world.
Both of these series end with an episode about bullfighting.
I think I have a right to speak about bullfighting because I was for a while, I don't quite know why, but I was an aspiring bullfighter. The men there with the capes are the matador's assistants. They're not trying to do anything fancy or flashy, they're just attempting to establish, if possible, if the bull has a bad eye or above all a hook, a tendency to hook to the right or left. That's a very important point.
There were originally 26 episodes commissioned, but due to chaos, only 6 were made. And even with the 6, disaster. But somehow Orson, the Riz Man, Welles, manages to present this duct tape travesty with a grace that allows the audience to believe this is yet another one of his art pieces. He speaks to the locals, immerses us in these deep conversations, often exploring a wide range of topics, dazzles us with beautiful scenery, guides us through bakeries. We are very much shaken on a trip with Mr. Welles. We may be forgiven for not noticing all the reused footage, the fact that some episodes are downright meandering and pointless, and the fact that there's hardly any traveling going on at all. Anyways, so what's the next thing you did?
Come on, read my future for me.
You haven't got any.
What do you mean?
Your future is all used up.
Touch of Evil is what many will argue is Orson Welles' actual greatest film. The film that would soon become the last in what is considered to be the film noir canon started out as a standard Hollywood thriller, but Welles, once again, after all these years, given a chance to direct after having rewritten scenes in another Universal picture he was acting in around this time.
Orson Welles, who knew his tremendous power and did not hesitate to use it.
He was originally just hired to act as a supporting character to Charlton Heston.
I said, who's going to direct it? They said, well, we haven't picked a director yet. We have Orson Welles to do the heavy, though. And after a static-filled pause, I said, why don't you have him direct it? He's a pretty good director, you know. And the reaction at first was a prolonged silence, as though I had suggested that my mother direct the film.
Now Heston, at this point, was in his peak in Hollywood, having just carried the biblical epic The Ten Commandments, and on the cusp of starring in the greatest gay rom-com epic of all time, Ben-Hur, where he'd play a character with a wonderful name.
They're my people. I'm one of them.
Be wise, Judah. It's a Roman world. If you want to live in it, you must become part of it.
The studios let him have his way, and Orson was given that Hollywood freedom for the first time at this scale, perhaps, since Kane. So he does the Orson Welles thing. He completely rewrites the script from being a standard cop thriller to a complex, highly stylized political drama about American racism and police brutality, giving maybe his greatest non-Shakespearean performance to date, completely obliterating the noir genre in the process, so his contemporaries can only call themselves neo-noir to display that no matter what they do, they're only imitating greatness. It's pretty good. Touch of Evil's pretty good, okay? It may very well be my second favorite Orson Welles, and no, number one is not Citizen Kane. The opening scene alone is one of the most iconic openings of all time, being a single take 3.5-minute unbroken shot following our Mexican protagonist and his American wife leave a building, cross the Mexico-American border, and witness a car bombing. Immediately, the pair are beset on all sides by this web of lies and conspiracy, becoming personally targeted by this truly evil, racist police officer who seeks to ruin our man's life.
Stick around, Vargas.
I intend to. Puedo usar el teléfono?
In English. I don't like to repeat myself.
I merely asked him if I could
Ask.
use the telephone. El teléfono está en la recámara.
Translation. The telephone is in the bedroom, senor.
And psychologically torture his wife. Side note, I find it very interesting how Welles managed to have a scene including Janet Leigh in a cabin that is, in my opinion, infinitely more unnerving than anything that happened in Psycho, then followed up with a psychological thriller starring Anthony Perkins, where he is perhaps the least unhinged person in the whole movie. Anyways, the product is one of the most unnerving, nightmarish, horrific, beautiful films from this era. One of those films that genuinely feels like something way, way more recent than the 1950s. Welles wrestles with a conflict that, as he shared in his sketchbook, is dear to his heart. Charlton Heston is in blackface. But we know that his casting is the only reason this film exists. Welles, after shooting and cutting, went to Mexico to work on something. But when he came back, you know what Universal did?
It is happening again. It is happening again.
They recut it again! The schmucks did it again! They claim they did it to tone it down. In desperation, Orson wrote them a 55-page memo begging and pleading with them to leave it as is. Of course he didn't. It flopped. Orson never worked in Hollywood again.
The Magnificent Ambersons was based on Booth Tarkington's novel. Stanley Cortez was the photographer. Mark Lee Kirk designed the sets. Al Fields dressed them. Robert Wise was the film editor. Freddie Fleck was the assistant director. Edward Stevenson designed the ladies' wardrobe. The special effects were by Vernon L. Walker. The sound recording was by Bailey Fessler and James G. Stewart. I wrote the script and directed it. My name is Orson Welles. This is a Mercury production.
Once when I first came out here to China, one of the sailors told the others about a thing which had happened to him. He told them a story.
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall.
The sailor was walking by himself near a harbor when a carriage drove up and a rich old gentleman said to him,
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall.
"You are a fine-looking sailor. Would you like to earn 5 guineas?" The sailor naturally answered,
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall.
yes. And the rich old gentleman drove him to his house, gave him food and wine.
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall.
Said to him, "I am very rich and very old, and I don't trust the people who will inherit what I've saved."
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall.
3 years ago, I married a young wife, but she's been no good to me. I've got no
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall.
With your permission, Mr. Clay, I also can tell that story.
What's that?
Laurence Olivier was an English actor and director of both stage and screen, who was also seen as a genius of the 20th century. Olivier was known for his own Shakespeare adaptations. His first screen adaptation of Shakespeare, funny enough, was also done in 1948. Like Wells, he was a visionary with perhaps an equally massive ego. As you might suspect, Lawrence and Orson became rivals, but it remained a mostly civil, friendly rivalry. Think Mickey Mouse versus Bugs Bunny back in those days. But boy, they both carried massive egos to them. This was until 1960 when they were collaborating on a certain play, Rhinoceros. Orson was set to direct and Olivier was set to star along with his soon-to-be wife, Joan Plowright. It was then that chaos erupted. Wells and Olivier were two giants, and the room simply wasn't big enough to hold them. They got into fight after fight, eventually resulting in Olivier banning Wells from rehearsals, and just directed the whole thing himself. Orson in the end was director in name only. He calls this the blackest time in his life. Orson Welles never did theater again. This whole debacle was adapted into a play in 2000 called Orson's Shadow.
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall.
I try not to use that word too much anymore. Genius. Over the years, I've fallen out of love with the whole thing. I try to make a deliberate effort not to buy into it too much. I don't think it's a very healthy practice to treat human beings like they are of a category above or below human. A lot of these perceived geniuses and Renaissance men, pure mythology.
I told a story to Buck Henry, and he told the story that he thought I had told him to a newspaper that I read the other day, and it bears not the slightest resemblance to what I said.
By calling them genius, we risk allowing them to get away with some stuff that they really shouldn't have. I still enjoy their work, but I don't like saying I'm a fan of people like Stanley Kubrick anymore. I can't look past the way he treated his actors, most infamously, of course, Shelley Duvall.
Video. We're killing ourselves out here, and you're going to be ready.
I am too. I'm standing
Should we
right
play
by
mood
the
music?
door. No, I can't.
Yeah, but when you came out like this,
Whom he trampled to get a performance out of her in The Shining.
And they said video rolling and all that, and I got all ready, and jumped up and down, and then they said, never mind, cut it. And then I went to take a bite of soup. The next thing I know, action, Shelley. So, if it hadn't been volley
She claims it was all for the greater good,
and sometimes butting of heads together, it wouldn't have come out as good as it did.
but respectfully, what else is she, this lowly actor, to say against a giant like Kubrick? Same for Hitchcock, who infamously treated his actors like cattle.
Called actors cattle once in your career and offended a few of them.
Well, I think I said, I was accused of calling actors cattle, and I said that I would never say such an unfeeling, rude thing about actors at all. What I probably said was that all actors should be treated like cattle.
I see. And you went on to do that.
In a nice way.
Yes.
And was quite infamously misogynist, even addressing this in his own work.
You know, it is, in finding out some of the things that you've done, reading about them and all, it's amazing how much is the director's work and how little the actors are needed. And
Then there's everything he did to Tippi Hedren, which I won't get into because I want to make money from this video. People shouldn't have to suffer in real life to make fiction. If it happens incidentally, it is what it is. But when you actively torment your actors or crew for fiction, that isn't cool. I just made a whole thing about the struggle of how artists are often prone to obsession and self-destruction. Again, I think if hurting yourself can be avoided, then by all means avoid it. But the ethics of whether a person does that to themselves is ultimately up to them. However, it is quite another thing when you bring others into it.
Genius? No. Michelangelo's a genius. John Ford is a genius, perhaps. Stanley, I think what stops him from being a genius, for me, is this lack of humanity. It's this withdrawing, this brilliant, yes. Extraordinary, yes. I mean, one of the greats, yes, all that. But I think at the end of the day, they say, well, what was he like as a man?
We're fucking killing ourselves out here.
What was he like as a human being?
Stop it, please, I beg you!
I think that's probably the test.
Though the thing about the job of a director, especially one of film or theater, is that there is a certain level of pomposity required just to do the job. You know, a less evil word for that is confidence. But in that setting, the way we view that person, the artist, culturally, it can easily become a sort of god complex.
No one wants to hear about my misery because they have their own. F everybody.
This way of thinking is also dangerous. The point is that making art, especially under a capitalist system, often requires that we amplify some of our more toxic traits. Oh, mamma mia, here we go again.
What's that? The old gentleman led this sailor to a bedroom which was lighted with candlesticks of pure gold. Was it not so, Mr. Clay? In the room there was a bed, and in the bed there was a lady. The old gentleman took from his purse a piece of gold.
How do you come to know this story?
If you'll let me, I'm about to pull on Orson Welles and break form to start speaking about myself. Not as much detail as the last time, though. I petrified the maidens enough. For the two of you who know my lore beyond what I disclosed in my last video, or know a bit of Japanese, you know that the title, The Myth of Genius, is quite meta. Tensai is the name I've assigned for myself for all my creative projects. I got it from the manga Slam Dunk because this is what the protagonist kept referring to himself as. You see, Tensai is the Japanese word for genius. And before I weepified it, that was my pseudonym. The thing is, if you go through my art Instagram, I don't know why you would, and scroll down a few years again, I don't know why you would, you'd see that that was my name, The Genius. I gave myself that title because that's what people have been calling me all my life. Some still do, though it beats me why.
I can't imagine why, but I love hearing it.
The thing is, though, part of the reason I gave myself that title was because I wanted to challenge myself to live up to it. In all my art, in all my stories, I want to blow people's minds. I want to constantly keep them guessing, never running slow, constantly one-upping myself.
I'm Charles Foster Kane. I'm no cheap, crooked politician trying to save himself from the consequences of his crime.
I weebified it to create a certain barrier when I started to actually believe it. That word, genius, carries with it a baggage you wouldn't believe. In the absolute hellscape that was high school, I made a deliberate effort to surround myself with fellow nerds and quote-unquote gifted kids. I know for a fact that many of you watching this video have been at some point a little genius / gifted kid, and are aware of the absolute horror that immediately befalls you when you leave that setting. You see, I don't know if genius is a thing that really exists. And if it does, I don't know if it's a thing to be celebrated at all. Earlier I mentioned Orson's stupidly high IQ, but I was quick to point out that that ostensibly means very little, if anything at all. Tests of any kind can only determine so much. And while I've been called brilliant my whole life for a certain set of things I do, if we were going by the grades I got in exams or tests growing up, we'd get an entirely different story. Most of the traits that those when they're young exhibit that are perceived as stereotypically genius, a lot of them may also be signs of neurodivergence. Neurodivergent literally means that your brain operates in a way that deviates from the norm. Many of those I knew in high school that swept home those grades, dean's list type deal. The second COVID hit and I was interacting with these guys outside of a school setting, some of them became the most neurotic, depressed, anxious people you've ever met. One who may in one setting be praised for being a multidisciplinary hyper-creative might just have some serious undiagnosed ADHD. They find themselves picking up and dropping hobbies, impulsively grabbing at different avenues, seeking validation, getting depressed when it doesn't work out, blaming themselves, blaming the world.
Everybody.
There's nothing wrong with trying things, you know, but failures have a special way of slamming you when you're always told that you're brilliant. There's the absolute number it does on your ego. Personally speaking, my ego at this point is like a yo-yo. Most of the time I either feel like the greatest person or the world's biggest clown. This isn't healthy. When you're constantly praised for being awesome at whatever nonsense you're doing, and you disappoint yourself, you disappoint others, you fail to live up to the image that people have of you in their head.
The old gentleman took from his purse a piece of gold. A 5-guinea piece, Mr. Clay.
How do you come to know this story?
You traveled on only one ship, so you've heard the story only once.
What's that got to do with my story?
Now, I'm by no means trying to imply that Georgie was on some kind of spectrum, but the thing that I'm really getting at is, as attractive and romantic as that word is, genius, I don't think it really exists in any true sense. I think people have skills. Maybe they're predisposed to being good at certain things. But creating this pedestal where you almost treat them like gods, I think that can only hurt people. Both them and the people around them.
From Gravesend to Lisbon, there was a sailor on that ship who told the story. On my way to Singapore.
I remember when the concept of Sigma male was created. I thought it was the funniest thing, and now a good Sigma grinds at meme never fails to make me laugh, because the thing is, half of those traits that are typically attributed to Sigma males, I kind of relate to, but those are flaws. Those are flaws. And while some of them aren't even necessarily flaws, it's just, why in the world would it be seen as a superior trait to prefer being alone? Introversion is introversion. It's not a choice. But it's not like it's some superpower. Not getting your energy from being around others doesn't make you smarter than them or anything. But we do live in an extroverted world, which often forces the introvert to go against their nature. It may become a rather attractive idea to the introverts that they are secretly this superior being somehow, because their lives are often made rather difficult because of this trait. Sigma male is an identity created for a certain kind of man to feel less bad about being himself. But in the process of idealizing these traits, they create this false sense of superiority that, of course, feeds into some rather misogynistic, egotistical, and self-destructive subtext. This obsession with turning people into ideas, it gets kind of dangerous.
Sailor on that ship who told the story. On my way to Singapore, I heard another sailor tell the story. The story they tell never happened. And that's why it is told. It never will happen, Mr. Clay.
These things you claim to be finding out about me don't speak of them to my daughter. You imagine it's pleasant to be ashamed of something you can't even remember.
Orson Welles, ever the innovator, adapted Kafka to the silver screen and managed to pull it off.
Miss Bershner?
You were expecting Miss Bershner?
The trial follows a man accused of a crime he doesn't know of, and he is put into this surrealist, nightmarish hellscape of trying to escape his inevitable death penalty.
Oh, what difference could a few shirts make to anybody once he's arrested?
Nothing.
Nothing at all, but still, you had to go ahead and denounce us.
Oh, well, it wasn't anything personal. I was just defending a principle.
Orson Welles never does stop writing about himself.
You should have been here 1 hour and 5 minutes ago.
Kafka's surrealism and biting social commentary is a surprising match made in heaven with Welles' experimental cinematography and editing, which is particularly jarring in all the best ways in this film. The trial is as if Orson Welles made an entire feature-length version of that final sequence in Lady from Shanghai in that funhouse.
You are a house painter?
No. I even thought you were afraid of me, but what you're feeling is pain.
You're stupid after being with girls.
That's it. Well, how about you?
Mind-bending, horrifying, anxiety-inducing. Actually, no. Touch of Evil may be my third favorite because this is me. I'm him. I'm Kay. At least in the novel.
Question from the examining magistrate about my being a house painter seems typical of this so-called trial. Why, the very notebook of the examining magistrate confirms what I say. These are the examining magistrate's records. What's happening to me is of no great importance, but I think it is representative of what's happening to a great many other people as well. It is for these others that I take my stand here, not for myself alone. That's it, boy, get him back!
The Franz Kafka novel explores the horrors of bureaucracy and the unfairness of the world. Reminds me of this one meme I saw that says, I'm a Wes Anderson character in a Tarantino world. Life is soup and I am fork. Brilliant.
Why? Why she's moving?
And you have the unmitigated gall to pretend you don't know.
I mean, we did talk this morning, but she didn't seem to be planning to
She
move.
wasn't, Mr. Kay.
Make it sound as if I were responsible.
Do you pretend you have nothing to do with it?
I don't pretend anything.
Though there is a difference between the novel and the film.
You came here this evening for a specific reason?
Yes, I came here to tell you that I'm dispensing with your services. I know you've done everything you can for me, and I appreciate it.
That being that in the novel, Joseph K. is written as being innocent. While both versions have him left completely in the dark as to what he's being accused of, Welles' K is guilty.
Damn, there I go again. It's never any use, is it, apologizing? It's even worse when you haven't done anything wrong and you still feel guilty.
Would anybody like to answer that question?
Well, my personal opinion...
Good. Stand up. Let's hear it.
My personal opinion is that it's true from what I've read from your career, although I wasn't alive at the time you first were making films. You've had a tremendous problem with the press and corporate bureaucracy dating back, since the earliest portions of your career. And that this is continuing today, and that's one of the reasons why you've been unable to finish some of your more recent projects.
It goes without saying that to be a bullfighter takes guts and skill. Because if a fighting bull can kill a tiger or an elephant, obviously can kill a man. It's because, of course, bullfights aren't a form of sport. They're a tragedy. The bullfight is a tragedy in 3 acts. And these noble creatures who are waiting for their death this afternoon are the heroes of that tragedy.
I'm in a strange place where I'm trying to write one story, but it keeps being intercut with another.
Accused men are attractive. Not that being accused makes any immediate change in a man's personal appearance. It can't be a sense of guilt. You can't all be guilty.
While researching this project, I found out a few things that I didn't know before and deliberately neglected to mention. Let's meet some other members of the cast, shall we? There's a scene towards the end of Citizen Kane where we watch Charles Foster Kane have an absolute meltdown after his wife, Susan Alexander, leaves him. What many don't know is that this scene is directly inspired from a meltdown by Orson Welles himself, where he physically assaulted John Houseman. John Houseman, surely you remember John Houseman. John Houseman, who produced and worked closely with young Welles back in the theater days, brought him to Broadway, produced Voodoo Macbeth, took him to radio, pretty much nurtured him up to Citizen Kane. Houseman was a close collaborator with Orson Welles, pretty much paved the way for his entire career in what was objectively his glory days back in radio and theater. When Welles got the Kane deal, as I mentioned before, the initial script was written by Herman Mankiewicz. A big reason why Kane is believed to be about William Randolph Hearst was because Mankiewicz was good friends with Hearst for a while.
You talk about the people as though you own them, as though they belong to you.
The spirit of the biting satire undoubtedly goes to Mank, who actually was supervised by Houseman. Houseman and Mank worked closely to create that first draft of the script, so having watched the man build it from the ground up while Welles was off doing God knows what, John suggested that Herman Mankiewicz get co-writing credit instead of Orson Welles just getting the solo credit. That's when he threw a flaming dish at him.
I'm Charles Foster Kane! I'm no cheap, crooked politician trying to save himself from the consequences of his crimes! Geddes! I'm gonna send you to Sing Sing! Sing Sing Geddes! Sing Sing!
Needless to say, their relationship was severed right there, and Mank added that meltdown into the script.
You wouldn't know the church out of the theater if it smacked you in the mouth.
Shut up, Orson, or I'll smack you in the
Fuck you, John.
To tell you the truth, over the course of doing research for this, I've happened upon several supporting characters in this story who, frankly, I think would make very interesting stories in their own right, but they aren't as visible. This isn't the story, the famous story that's always told. It's always...
What is his name? What is his name?
Shadow.
I mentioned before that the reason why I've more or less lost faith in supposed geniuses like Hitchcock and Kubrick was for how they treated their actors and the often absurd conditions that they put into getting a scene. That would suggest that Orson Welles was above such tomfoolery.
Was she an intelligent actress?
Yeah. Of course, her whole thing was tremendously tricked. We blew dangerous drugs in her eyes and sprayed her throat so she couldn't talk and everything. She was to do all that, but she was still great.
Orson Welles, who knew his tremendous power and did not hesitate to use it.
In fact, while Welles is always praised for his artistry and vision, he didn't make it easy for them.
What did Welles lack, or what did Ford and Hawks and Hitchcock have that kept Welles from fulfilling the enormous potential that...
Well, it's hard to say. Orson made Citizen Kane, and Hearst thought it was about him, and he blacklisted the picture, and a lot of theaters wouldn't play it.
But at the same time, there is something in him that drives him to alienate the people with the money.
Charles Laughton was another exciting director, but he was a disciplined director, and he knew the value of a dollar. Orson didn't.
Most theaters wouldn't play it. And as a result, the next picture, Amberson, was released badly, and
perhaps there is a subconscious streak that makes him resent that, unlike a painter who, if he had to, could work in a supermarket and earn the money to buy paints, that as a director, he cannot do that. He must somehow persuade a studio to give him the money.
He lacked life skills.
he just got a bad name in Hollywood.
I cannot believe that
Emotional intelligence.
he would not have been more successful than he has been.
Charlton Heston told me that when they were making A Touch of Evil together, one of Welles's most marvelous films, he and Charlton Heston got on very, very well together, and he was lamenting to Heston that nobody employed him in Los Angeles.
Your levels of perception are notable, and everybody here today has heard them. If there was something that you thought, I don't know, something interesting and psychological that kept him from finishing.
And Heston said, well, who's your agent? He said, I don't have an agent. And Heston said, well, would you like to meet my agent? I mean, he's pretty, powerful. He could help you.
Well, he would leave maybe a picture before he should.
The guy came for a meeting with Welles, and he said Orson, I'm such a fan of yours. May I call you Orson? And Wells said, Mr. Wells will do. End of
He
conversation.
would go watch the cutting, but then he'd go and do something else and come back.
End of wonderful opening.
When you leave a picture for a while,
end of possibility.
The studio takes over, you know.
He didn't want to feel dependent on anybody, but he was dependent on everybody.
Back in the theater days, this wasn't abnormal, but people quite literally died on those stages. He worked the people all night. He didn't like them taking breaks. Children or adults, it didn't matter. He worked them like cattle.
But even some of the honest men abuse their power in other ways.
Orson, you know, the crew has been here since 7 o'clock. They should go to lunch. All right, I'm not hungry, but if the crew has to go to lunch, let them go to lunch.
Your dad was an inventor.
Yes.
What did he invent? Anything we would know of?
He invented a great many things, none of which worked. But he liked to call himself an inventor because what he was.
Do you know where he came from?
Big, rich family in Ohio. You should pretend to be a great tycoon. You mustn't say you're a playboy.
He graduated from boarding school.
Our story is about a special group of these, the richest and smartest. He inherited some money and he spent it.
One of the largest individual stockholders in the public transit company.
The trouble is you don't realize you're talking to two people.
So he put down I'm an inventor so it would be respectable.
If we can't die in behalf of progress, we can live for it.
I can also afflict. Only to point out and make public the dishonesty, the downright villainy.
We must be worthy of our luck or we are damned. Our lives were spared, but this is merely the silliest of accidents.
In Orson's version, you can hear his thundering voice. He's guilty as hell.
Talk about the people as though you own them. As long as I can remember, you've talked about giving the people their rights, as if you could make them a present of liberty.
And it has to do with a kind of voyeurism. And these fantasies came up through the years.
The fact that a lot of people disliked you for what to them.
I don't think anybody did.
Really?
No.
Wasn't there a hue and cry?
Most of the hue and cry was made by the newspapers because there was a big chance to attack radio, which was taking the advertising away from them.
Oh.
Most people just thought it was funny. There were, of course, a lot of people who called up in tears, but basically people thought it was funny.
Don't believe everything you hear on the radio.
And I'd call it emotional parasitism. And it has to do with the whole mystique of the He-Man. This picture we're going to make is against He-Man.
Get us a drink, will you, sweetie?
The people who go to bullfights, not occasionally as tourists do.
What you imitate is him. The man, not the movies. Your idea of him.
And this fellow, he's a tough movie director who has killed 3 or 4 extras in every picture.
You don't like what you see, do you? It's my mouth. You think you can tell from my mouth that I'm condemned?
What is it you're so afraid they're going to find out?
That's his stuff. Full of charm.
You've lived all over the place. What opinion do you have of some of the generalizations that are made about the country, that there's something violent in the American character, for example, or that
there is.
Or that the country's...
I think there is, don't you?
I think
there always has been.
And I'm an American. Always been an American.
What's next? Citizen Kane wasn't even his first film?
I've been lying my head off.
The Hearts of Age is very much the type of film that I would make if I actually decided to shoot an actual short film.
He's riding around, following a bullfighter and living through him.
Wells and his friends shot this at the end of that summer festival they did for the Todd School. It is very much a student film. It's an experimental avant-garde little showcase with something resembling a plot, but I know for a fact that this was purely made to experiment with this enticing new medium of cinema.
You know, he's become that lovely young fellow in the beautiful costume, and that fellow's danger is his danger.
He's very much just throwing ideas at the wall along with his friends, not really trying to make anything deep or whatever.
That fellow's success is his, and so on.
Just seeing what they can do with this fascinating technology. It was clear from this early that Wells had no intention of being in some kind of industry.
But he's become obsessed by this young man who has become, in a way, his own dream of him.
Or making things for anyone, really, but himself.
He's been rejected by all his
He just wanted to see what he could do with this technology. Honestly, space. It almost makes me look past the blackface.
Brush up your Shakespeare.
In his third and final Shakespeare film, Orson Welles directs and stars as a side character in several Shakespeare plays. Falstaff.
He that kills me some 6 or 7 dozen of Scots at a breakfast, washes his hands and says to his wife, "Fie upon this quiet life, I want work."
How could the world pick out such an enemy again as that feed Percy the Hotspur of the North doth not thy blood thrill at it? Art thou not horrible of fear?
A comic relief character, a drunken old fool, filmed in... a drunken old fool. A comic relief character, a drunken old fool.
He's finally been shown up to be a kind of voyeur, a piqueur.
Filmed in Spain, and again funded primarily by taking a bunch of acting roles. Interestingly enough, one of these being a short film by Italian filmmaker Pier Paolo Pasolini, where he plays an incompetent foreign director.
Lei non ha capito niente perché è un uomo medio e così.
This short got Pasolini arrested because of its subversive themes.
Harry, I do not only marvel where thou spendst thy time.
Welles celebrates this drunken old fool, John Falstaff, that serves as support to Henry IV. The film celebrates the spectacle and scale of Shakespeare, and as I'm always reminded when I see his Shakespeare adaptations, this is the man at his absolute peak as an actor.
Bare land, manured, husbanded and tilled with excellent endeavor of drinking good and good store of fertile cherries, that he has become very hot and valiant.
Quite possibly my favorite performance from him in general, and this is only called the best of his Shakespeare adaptations.
Quotations, and to addict themselves to sack.
Chimes of Midnight is the perfect conclusion of his Shakespearean trilogy. Each of these films feels more personal than the last, from the dread of Macbeth to the paranoia of Othello, now concluding with the regret of Chimes of Midnight. Falstaff is no saint, he makes no pretense of such, but he is loyal to Henry IV, he's his friend. He's made his mistakes, but he's been faithful. Now look at him, he's a joke. He's the king of nothing. Maybe he was something at one point, maybe he never truly was. The final exchange between Henry and Falstaff cuts deep.
Have you your wits? Know you what 'tis you say? My king! I speak to thee, my heart.
I know thee not, old man. Fall to thy prayers.
This feels real.
How ill white hairs become a fool and jester.
Otterley cast aside at his lowest point, begging and pleading for an ounce of sympathy from the boy he helped build, and being met with a coldness. Welles laments an industry which has utterly cast him aside, despite him having helped legitimize it. Then again,
I know thee not, old man. Fall to thy prayers.
She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out. Out. Brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow. A poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
Not a bit. There aren't any old times, but times are gone. They're not old, they're dead. There aren't any times but new times.
The late 60s and early 70s saw film as a medium revolutionize in a way never seen before. After deliberate pushback against Hollywood conventions by various European art movements and New Wave movements, political, social, and philosophical revolution, film, and indeed art in general, was an entirely different beast. This is the era that I would argue was the true golden age of cinema and potentially humanity if there was still not so much work to be done. Everyone was experimenting, challenging the medium, constantly trying to redefine it. All the themes that got Wells in trouble back in the old times had now become the norm.
Major studio is a bullshit word, but that's the word. And I made a picture that made money. That's what I want to do.
That's right. What about those people who can't first make a picture that makes money? They're not interested in making a picture that makes money. That's my point.
All that strange camera movement, all those edits, confusing endings, abstract spectacle, all of this was now the norm. If there was a time for Orson Welles to thrive, now would be that time.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sir John Falstaff.
In the late 60s, in a rush to get funding for his films, he would star in just about every cheap commercial film he could get his hands on. Some better than others.
Oh. Who is this man?
Meanwhile, he would, along with his partner in both art and life at this point, Oya Kodar, start filming many projects that were never finished. I knew about Oya before I knew about Paola Mori, who was still his wife. That man cheated on all three of his wives, though this one was the least secret of them all. In the last of Wells' work, she is ever present.
After your old tricks, I see.
Why not? I'm a charlatan.
She and Peter Bogdanovich.
He says to me, I said, I'm Peter Bogdanovich. He said, oh, good. He said, I can't tell you how long I've wanted to meet you.
Peter Bogdanovich is a notable figure of his own, being both a film scholar and iconic filmmaker in his own right during the New Hollywood movement, which was underway at this point.
The museum called me and asked me to do Orson. I said to Richard Griffith, who was the curator, I said, why don't you do it, Dick? You usually do those things. He said, well, I don't like Orson Welles. He said, since you like him, I had written a program note for a theater in which I said that Othello was the greatest Shakespeare film ever made. And that was not the common wisdom at that time. Everybody thought the Olivier films were.
Right.
Wells was to Peter, as I understand it, what Federico Fellini or Elia Kazan was to Scorsese. Batman to Robin, hero and sidekick.
Of course you're close, you two. You have to be. You have no choice.
Peter was a Wells scholar and they met in 1969 when Wells commissioned him to write a book about him and his career.
Why did you want to meet me? He said, because you have written the truest words ever published about me. Pause, in English.
Clearing up once and for all the truth about the writing of Citizen Kane.
You have no choice.
Please, dear lady, don't tell us what you mean by that.
In these last few years, while it seemed like the world had turned its back on him, Wells had people like Bogdanovich in his corner.
I don't like pretense. I don't like prophecies. I like facts.
The second to last feature film Wells completed in his lifetime was one he did for French television.
This story has never happened. No.
Yes, Mr. Clay.
I want it to happen.
The French.
Immortal Stories may be the most decidedly contemplative of Wells's features, expressing many of the themes seen throughout his career, but with a more abstract approach. Also, there's color! The plot follows an old tycoon living in China at the end of his life, as he hires two young people to act out the events of a story for him.
Would you like to earn 5 guineas tonight?
He believes no story is interesting if it isn't real. This old man picks up two people off the street to enact this romantic encounter.
The 2 young, strong, and lusty jumping jacks.
He wants to live vicariously, but they won't let him. Reality can't completely fade away, no matter how rich and powerful he is or was.
That room. That bed.
They do end up doing what he wants, though he isn't given the satisfaction of watching.
It's all
nothing but a story. My story.
Maybe that isn't so important to him in the end.
He's dead, Miss Virginie.
He dies the next morning.
So what's funny? Old age.
That film wouldn't see the screen for another decade, but in any case, given the reasons I listed before, Wells would return to Hollywood in hopes of having his great comeback in this newfound time of independence, to make what would have been his final completed narrative feature film, his grand finale, his magnum opus, The Other Side of the Wind.
Fine, rolling. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, I'm ready to go.
Just go right ahead and talk, Mr. Hannaford. Don't mind us.
I'll go first.
Mr. Hannaford, is the camera eye a reflection of reality, or is reality a reflection of the camera eye? Or is the camera merely a phallus?
I want a drink.
We'd follow a veteran filmmaker who returns to Hollywood to throw a party to screen a film he's making, though he died the following day. Orson Welles denies that it is about him.
And it has to do with a kind of voyeurism, mystique, not of the bull, which we read so much, perhaps too much, but the whole mystique of the He-Man.
As I open my mouth, we raise our glasses to a great gentleman who is not only a great artist, but one who's been called the Ernest Hemingway of the cinema.
And our story is about a pseudo Hemingway.
Sure. John Huston, fellow veteran filmmaker and close friend of Wells, cited as starting from the film noir genre with The Maltese Falcon. Around the same time, Wells went to Hollywood, played the role of the lead.
Hannaford. Hannaford himself.
Peter Bogdanovich was to play his young filmmaker companion, defending him against his critics.
You think you have to be as rude as he is.
Rude as you are, in print anyway.
I liked your last
Yeah,
picture.
sure.
No, I know that it was repetitive, but shit. But for what it was,
The film was to be highly improvised, casting lots of real filmmakers and critics to play filmmakers and critics. It was shot sort of like a documentary featuring different footage from different cameras, different points of view, different aspect ratios, some black and white, some color. Leah Kodar was largely in charge of writing, directing, and starring in the film that Huston's character was developing. A kind of parody of European art cinema. The footage is some of the most gorgeous filmmaking I have ever seen, but I can barely show any of it because of its Europeanness. This highly experimental project would be Wells's great whites that he would pursue for years. But if you've been paying any attention at all, you know how this story ends.
There's a picture that you're still making, is there not, called The Other Side of the Wind?
It's really done. We're just making pickup shots and...
But it's been going on for 4 years, has it not?
Well,
the only, there are only two main projects which are unfinished. One is The Other Side of the Wind, and when I tell you that my partner in that project is the brother-in-law of the late Shah of Iran, you will understand why we're having a little legal difficulty.
As problems upon problems, financial problems and legal problems compounded the production, it was becoming increasingly clear to everyone involved that this film may very well never see its end, though Wells may just pursue it for the rest of his life.
102, take two.
The French champagne has always been celebrated for its excellence. The French.
Orson Welles at this point, having returned to Hollywood, became a regular figure on people's television sets, often appearing in late-night talk shows.
Tried to hide, because if that ever happens, I'm sure I'm guilty. I don't know how.
Absolutely.
The minute I see a cop, I know I did it.
Having guest appearances on TV
I hate
shows.
to say this, but I'm afraid Bill's letting himself go.
I think he looks positively frumpy.
And of course, doing commercials.
Last night I journeyed backwards in time to the medieval world of Dark Tower. In this amazing game, I had to find 3 keys, lay siege to the tower, and defeat the enemy within. Each move was a challenge. The computer kept track, giving me secret information, pictures, sounds, surprises. Then, ahead of my opponent, I made my move. The battle was joined, and I was victorious. Dark Tower.
Orson Welles, the magician, it seemed, had become Orson Welles, the clown. Falstaff.
The following film, made in 1982, was thought to be lost forever.
This was the point when the Orson Welles impression really became a sport. I mean, how could you not?
Good. Are you on?
The man had become a caricature of himself anyway with that booming voice.
I'd like to address my portrayal by the alleged comedian Jack Black.
Trademark cigar and larger-than-life frame.
This better be good, Mort. You got me out of the shower.
Oh, please don't take yourself dry this time, Your Immenseness. Last time it rained for weeks.
Rosebud frozen peas, full of country goodness and green penis. Wait, that's terrible.
He appeared constantly on chat shows.
With very little substance supported.
And he had to put up with, as he said, because he was by now getting fatter and fatter and fatter and fatter. He could hardly walk. He was being moved around in a wheelchair. And he had to put up, he said, pain, he's had to put up with fat jokes.
Mr. Wells, you make Wimpy look skimpy.
Well, you see, I'm fat and you're ugly, but I can diet.
Which humiliated him deeply.
Wells, who at this point was finding it increasingly difficult not to express his bitterness, talked trash about just about every working filmmaker.
What the hell are we doing? We're having a party!
Some of which may be justified, others maybe not.
He's an idiot, Jake. They're all idiots. You know that.
He's your idiot.
Wells and Bogdanovich never really had the same closeness after he shot him some strays in one of his TV appearances.
You can kiss my sweet ass.
What did I do wrong, Daddy?
Wells would continue his endeavors, even pitching his own talk show in the late 70s, though it wasn't picked up. Darn shame too. Sort of been the greatest talk show of all time. Even got the Muppets.
These magicians, quite a lot of them died just attempting it. Including, you'll remember, Chung Ling Soo. Strangely enough, it was during the police autopsy that the Chinese conjurer's pigtail came loose. And it was only then that an astonished world discovered he was no Chinese at all. Chung Ling Soo was an American named Robinson.
He believed that if he appeared on television often enough, some producer would say, "Look, there's Orson Welles. I'll sign him up. I'll get him to make a film for me."
In any case, Wells would continue working on projects that went nowhere, ranting about Hollywood, complaining about frozen peas.
Every July, peas grow there. You really mean that?
Getting drunk on wine commercials. And bullying his directors.
This is a lot of shit, you know that. You're such pests. Now what is it you want? In your depths of your ignorance, what is it you want?
Throughout the 70s and 80s. Popular culture seemingly refused to take him seriously anymore. He was a joke. Every time he'd plead for funding, he'd be shut down. It was over.
When first the flush of a newborn sun fell on the green and gold, our father Adam sat under the tree and scratched with a stick in the mold, till the devil whispered behind the leaves. It's pretty, but is it art?
Orson Welles' final completed film outside of the TV documentary he did, speaking of his filming of Othello, was an experimental documentary essay film, as he described it, called F for Fake. He worked on this in 1972 and 3 while battling with The Other Side of the Wind. Produced in France, this documentary focuses on a famous art faker, Elmire Deroy.
Yes, his world is a world of make-believe.
And Clifford Irving.
He is always right. Elmire. There's just no way of talking about Elmire and leaving out Cliff Irving. Elmire plays a very important role in his biographer's own story.
A fellow faker who wrote his biography as well as a fictitious autobiography on Howard Hughes.
I do not know Clifford Irving, said the voice.
All over the world, people were saying that really the fishiest thing in this whole business, but the identity of whoever it was who claimed to Irving he was Hughes.
While not being the first experimental documentary, F for Fake is considered to be the first of what we now call the video essay. If you're watching this right now, and like other video essays of this kind, this film right here is where it all started. And if you've been paying any attention at all, this is my favorite Orson Welles film, and it is not even close.
Fool, once in a while, somebody very, very pompous and somebody very
pretentious. Now I think he can capture that personal honesty.
This is not only my favorite Orson Welles film, this is one of my favorite films of all time.
Amir was a good teacher, if only by example, and his most valuable lesson was this: don't be spooked by the experts.
Well, my opinion about expert is that it's something far too overestimated. It's a métier who shouldn't even exist.
And how right he was.
It should not exist that one single person makes a decision about what's good or what's bad.
Orson may not have been able to complete everything he wanted to, but this, I think, is the perfect bookend to his career.
By way of introduction, this is a film about trickery and fraud, about lies. Tell it by the fireside or in a marketplace or in a movie. Almost any story is almost certainly some kind of lie.
Orson Welles slips between fact and fiction as he discusses other professional liars, examining the nature of truth and how we perceive it, especially in the context of art.
Rarity. The chief cause and encouragement of fakery and phoniness.
Oh yeah? Who really is the authority of what is and isn't art? Is it the experts? Is it us individually? If you're able to perfectly replicate a painting that is considered a masterpiece, are you an artist?
Having a personal vision.
And each man hears as the twilight nears to the beat of his dying heart, the devil drum on the darkened pane. It's pretty, but was it art?
Art, take two.
If you're able to fold and distort narratives, are you not an artist? That's what storytelling is, isn't it? Manipulating people, tricking them, deluding them, but making them think in the process.
Lots of oysters, only a few pearls.
I would love to know what he would think about AI art.
Useless.
Orson Welles explores these pseudo-artists as well as reflects on his own career.
The golden years.
A little bit of luck.
And a dash of larceny.
And his relationship with trickery and forgery. How he got his start in Ireland, how he allegedly fooled the world with War of the Worlds. He speaks of Howard Hughes, who, interestingly enough, was the first inspiration he thought of for Kane before Hearst. All while pulling his little card tricks, manipulating and misleading the audience. He and his girlfriend Oya, playing pranks on us, but raising some very thought-provoking points. That monologue I mentioned earlier that started this whole terrible obsession, that comes from this film. Welles admires these old cathedrals.
Might be just this one anonymous glory of all things. This rich stone forest, this epic chant, this gaiety, this grand choiring shout of affirmation.
They're artists now anonymous, lost to time. But the cathedrals stand.
To mark where we have been.
The ghosts of a dead time.
To testify to what we had it in us to accomplish.
All their victories, all their evils, all the symbols they carry.
Our works in stone, in paint, in print, are spared, some of them for a few decades or a millennium or two, but everything must finally fall in war, or wear away into the ultimate and universal ash.
Dead artists on what they saw and felt.
The triumphs and the frauds, the treasures and the fakes, a fact of life. We're going to die.
Orson Welles died in 1985. He was at his typewriter, probably drafting some other story that would never see the light of day. Hair cold, lifeless, at that parodied forgotten French champagne-sipping court jester. His final acting credit was on the first Transformers movie. He played a planet.
You cannot destroy my destiny.
Are you, in fact, also still interested? I know it was a passion of yours in previous years in bullfighting.
I'm interested in what I remember.
You don't?
I don't like it much anymore.
Why is that?
Well, two things. First of all, bullfighting, as somebody once said, indefensible and irresistible.
There may not be, as much humanity in the world as one would like to see, but there is some. There's more than one would think. In any case, if you break faith with what you know.
It is irresistible when everything is as it ought to be, both with the beast and with the brave man who meets that brave animal for a ritualistic encounter. I'm not going to go into all that mystique, which has been pretty worn out. But
that's a betrayal of many, 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 many people. I may know 6 people, but that's enough. Love has never been a popular movement, and no one's ever wanted really to be free.
The fact is that it has become an industry which depends on its existence with the tourist trade. So it's become folkloric. And I hate anything which is folkloric.
Walk down the street of any city, any afternoon, and look around you. What you got to remember is what you're looking at is also you. Everyone you're looking at is also you.
But I haven't turned against bullfighting because it needs a lot of Japanese in the front row to keep going, and it does. But I've turned against it for very much the same reason that my father, who was a great hunter, suddenly stopped hunting. He said, "I've killed enough animals, and I'm ashamed of myself." And I was a bad tororito, for a while myself, and I've seen too many hundreds of bullfights, thousands of them, I suppose, and wasted a lot of my life now that I look back on it. And although it's been a great education to me in human terms and in many other ways.
You could be that person. You could be that monster. You could be that cop. And you're to decide in yourself not to be.
I begin to think that I've seen enough of those animals die.
Popeye for me, growing up, we always sing the song. And you were doing the sound earlier, and I could have died.
Thank you.
And I just wanted you to know what that meant to me. And that I know I'm not alone. And in telling you this, I think a lot of people share the same experiences, and we love you so much.
Thanks.
You're so welcome.
I'm so glad that the
I didn't mean to make it sad, but...
No, it's not. It's wonderful.
You mean so much to so many of us. You mean a lot to a lot of people, and I feel like I'm carrying that torch for a lot of people to let you know. See, I'm getting shaky, and I'm getting a little weepy that you're so loved.
Well, I sometimes wonder. I don't know why you do not live here. And there...
Well, let me give you an answer.
All right.
I had to get some...
This one edited clip from his appearance on the Tom Snyder Show is hilarious, but it is based on truth.
You don't live in the United States or in the...
You think it's arrogant not to?
Well,
They always want to know why he runs off to make films in Europe. I mean, if you somehow made it this far, you may have some idea why he felt that way. But the genuine curiosity of his interviewers is what always gets me.
I'm very happy in America, but it happens that America is not as happy with me as I am with it.
And then they followed up saying something like this.
The question is interesting and loaded with inaccuracies. The principal one of which is that I am now successful.
This is if we measure success, Orson, only by the amount of money one has or the fine things, the material possessions.
Yeah.
But I would call somebody a success any man or any woman who has earned the respect, of his peers.
And of course, you are one of their great heroes.
Doesn't seem to be anybody wants to go to movies anymore.
You know,
Can I interrupt for just
10
10 seconds?
please do.
But Catch-22 was recently sneak previewed in Boston. Yeah. And when Orson said all of the young kids really want to make films and so forth, only 50 students were told that it was Catch-22.
Who is accorded the kinds of tributes that you were given by the American Film Institute earlier this year.
And by the time 8 o'clock in the evening came along, there was such a mob they had to run it twice, back to back. 90% of the audience were young, bright college students.
Really? That's good news.
Now, when your name came on the screen, there was a standing ovation. The biggest of all.
For his accomplishments such as Citizen Kane, for the marvelous scene with the mirrors that we saw in the...
When the name Orson Welles came on, from this young generation, the whole place fell apart. I don't know whether you guys had heard that, but it's true.
The fact is, a lot of his appearances you'll see later in his life, you'll see him talking to students, all of which seem to know everything about him. Even going back to Bogdanovich before, who was so quick to come to his defense and still praised the hell out of him and included him in his work, years, up to decades after he died. Bogdanovich himself passed away a couple years ago, but up to the very end, he always spoke fondly of Welles and mentions him as having been his friend.
So I said, you know, there's only one picture of yours I don't really like that much. Which one? The Trial. I don't either. So about 6 months later, or something, I mentioned something negative about The Trial. He said, we should stop saying that. I said, I thought you didn't like it. No, I like it very much. I just said that to please you. But I respect your opinion. And when you denigrate it, you diminish my small treasure. I said, oh shit, Orson.
Oh yeah, who still returns the rights over Welles' unfinished films, is always campaigning to preserve them and have them finished. Every filmmaker, critic, scholar seemingly universally give Citizen Kane praise as being one of the greatest, if not the all-time greatest film.
And I've seen it countless times, you know.
The fact that so many creators in those fields, film, radio, theater, still cite him as being one of their heroes.
Us in the business, he's a pioneer and a hero, and to people who are not in the business, he's a legend. But
implementing his techniques, studying his work, revolutionizing radio dramas, bringing high art to the masses, opening the doors for minorities to star in roles that have otherwise been closed to them. It's all true that film he was halted from in Brazil has been completed and compiled into a whole documentary. The original cuts of Touch of Evil, as well as intended, was put together by fans and is now the default version of the film you will find. You can now watch half of Orson Welles' entire filmography for free on this very website, including the once lost Too Much Johnson. But what I think is the biggest, greatest accomplishment of all of these is the fact that The Other Side of the Wind, Welles' Great White, the beast that haunted him for the last couple decades of his life, through the help of Peter Bogdanovich, Oya Kodar, and Netflix, has been completed, releasing in 2018 in crisp, pristine quality. The studios, the execs, they might have tried to squash him, oh, but the people.
Orson Welles.
Columbia Network takes pride in presenting Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air, dramatizing famous characters.
That's more than I got.
Orson Welles is dead. Genius, clown, artist, activist, pompous bastard, communist.
A ham sandwich.
Whatever he was, he's gone. But the images remain. The art.
No, what we professional liars hope to serve is truth. I'm afraid the pompous word for that is art. Picasso himself said it. Art, he said, is a lie. A lie that makes us realize the truth.
It is a particular kind of art from a particular world, from a particular perspective.
What you got to remember is what you're looking at is also you.
I don't know what to think about Orson Welles. I may have just conjured up someone in my head and been living vicariously through that image. But maybe fake names like that, in the end, don't matter. Maybe individuals and their self-images aren't so important as the impact that they have on the people around them. Their legacy, what they saw, and what they felt.
Be of good heart. Cry the dead artists out of the living past.
The legacy they carry with all its beauty and all its baggage. At least it makes for an interesting story.
Our songs will all be silenced. But what of it? Go on singing. Maybe a man's name doesn't matter all that much.